You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Hello, Will.
And hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 100 of the Common Descent Podcast.
We did it.
We did it.
Triple digits.
Wow.
Took us almost 4 years.
Yeah, it did.
This is it. Episode 100. If you've been listening to the podcast up until this point, we had a bit of discussion about what to do for this episode. We reached out to our listeners and asked for suggestions. What would be a suitably fitting, grandiose topic that would be a function like a normal episode, but still be worthy of episode 100.
Yeah, still feel like it was a good pick.
And I think we've settled on a good choice.
I think we did. Today we will be discussing the origin of life.
What bigger topic could there be? Yeah, no,
this is one of the big ones. And so that's the topic for the episode today, and we're going to be looking at this. We're going to have to come at it from multiple angles because it is a complex topic. Like, we're used to covering big topics. We've done that on the podcast before. It's not like it's easy every time, but we've done it. This one's a little different because it's big, but it is not one question. You have to answer multiple questions to deal with the origin of life.
Right.
So we're going to take a look at, first, what is life? Or what do we think life is? Or at least, what are we saying life is right now? We're going to look at what is our earliest evidences. What do we think the earliest life was like? When did it show up? What do we know about that? And then we'll take a look at what are some of the common ideas, hypotheses, and notions about how life could have started.
Yeah, this is one of those great questions in science where we have a bunch of great evidence, we have a bunch of great ideas, a bunch of great hypotheses, and we're not sure which one's right.
Yeah, no solid answer. This is a complex, more philosophical in many ways topic than you might think for a scientific podcast.
So we're excited to get into it.
Now, this episode was suggested when we reached out to ask for ideas for episode 100, and we had requests for topics related to this before that as well. And so, thank you to our requesters, who include Brian, Pete, and Leon, and our patrons, Mark and Colleen.
Thanks, everybody. Good idea.
Good topic.
We had a bunch of suggestions for this. All cool ideas. They're all still on the list, don't worry.
Oh, yes. Yeah, nothing got thrown out.
Yeah.
This one just is... This felt like the right one for episode 100.
If we didn't pick your suggestion, check in episode 200.
Yes.
We'll see what we can
do. Just almost another 4 years, and that'll be the time. Now, before we move on to the episode, let's get our announcements out of the way. We have a few cool announcements this time. First and foremost, as has become routine every episode, we have a Patreon. And if you are on that Patreon at a certain level, we like to shout your name out to thank you. And it sounds a bit like this. Thanks, Andreas, Rhonda, and David.
Thank you to our patrons for joining us, to our new patrons. Thank you to our old patrons for supporting us. Remember, you get goodies if you join us on Patreon, like this and more.
Yes, so check it out if you're interested. Speaking of extra stuff coming up, we're reaching the end of the year.
We sure are.
2020 is wrapping up, thank goodness.
Thank goodness.
And every year, at the close of that year, we like to do our Q&A. Our end of the year Q&A, where we put out a form for anyone to ask any question they'd like, and then we will answer those mailbag style on however long an episode it takes.
We've done this twice now, 2018, 2019. The form will be live as of the day this podcast is released.
Yeah, so go to your computers right now.
Go check it out. We're going to put the link in the episode description. We'll also be posting the link repeatedly on our social medias, on the Twitter, the Facebook, and the Instagram. So check those out. If you have any sort of questions, science-y questions, personal questions, silly questions, it's always a ton of fun.
All questions are welcome and thoroughly enjoyed.
Yes.
It's always a ton of fun.
That form will be live starting the day this episode releases, and it will be up for a month.
Yes.
So in mid-December, we will close it, and then we will take the next couple of weeks to go through them, answer them, record the thing for you, and then we will release that at the end of the year.
Absolutely. And then our next few announcements have to do with the fact that it's episode 100.
We are in triple digits.
We are actually in triple digits now. We've been close for so long, it seems. And now we're here, and we wanted to kind of take a moment just to say thanks, everyone.
Thanks. It's been super fun doing this podcast. We're not stopping now.
No.
More to come. And it's always exciting to see the support we get from people, from our patrons, of course, from all of our listeners, everyone who sends us messages on social media or emails, either complimenting us or asking us questions, or every now and then providing constructive criticism.
Which has been very constructive at times.
Like, yes, we appreciate
made active changes due to those messages.
Absolutely. Non-constructive criticism, you can keep that to yourself.
Yes,
but the helpful stuff, absolutely, it's great. It's been super fun doing this podcast, and it's so exciting to see that we have an audience out there that really tunes in and really gets excited about it.
Absolutely. Well, this podcast is something that we make because we enjoy it, and we believe in what we're trying to do with it. But the community that you all have formed while listening to us and have interacted with us has been a huge part of what's made it such an amazing experience. I was not prepared when we started this for how cool it's been, and I am always floored by how cool it continues to be. Yeah. So thank you to every single one of our listeners.
And we're not going to gush too much here for two reasons. One, we have an episode to do.
Yes.
And two, we're going to do that elsewhere.
Yeah, we are going to have a episode 100 retrospective. Look back at the podcast, look back at everything that it's been from episode 1 to now, and just kind of share our thoughts on the whole process.
Yeah, so we'll be releasing that as a bonus audio. It'll show up on the podcast episodes list. I don't know that there's going to be a script. I think we're just going to talk about what it's been like to get here. So if you're into that sort of
behind the scenes, getting our perspective on things, check that out. It'll be coming out not too long after this episode drops, so keep your eyes out for that as well. Absolutely. Also, for episode 100, we are going to be doing a Patreon video chat. So we will be having a live chat with our patrons. So we'll be announcing details for that soon, so keep an eyes out. Keep your eyes on your email and on our Patreon. If you are a patron, try it out, see how it goes, hopefully have some fun. Absolutely. And now we'll about wrap up our announcements, which means we can move on to the first section of the episode, which is the news. As usual. That's not changing for episode 100. Nope. We still got we got news worthy of episode 100, I think. Every episode, we like to round up some of the recent science news, paleontological, evolutionary, biology, all of the cool stuff that's been happening in the science world to keep us up to date and to keep you all up to date. And to share with us first, I turn it over to David. Well, that's me. I'm going to start with dinosaur disease. Gross. It is, actually. This is research by Tito Aureliano et al. In the journal Cretaceous Research. And as always, we will link our news articles on the blog post that goes along with the episode. And this bit of news is represented by an article in Scientific American by Chris Baranyuk. The diseased dinosaur in question in this study is a titanosaur. So these are one of the more popular and among the largest in some species of the sauropod dinosaurs. Yeah. Long necks, long tails, Littlefoot style dinosaurs. But this one is not known from a giant skeleton. It is known from part of a fibula, one leg bone, from the Cretaceous of Brazil around 80 million years ago. The focus of this research is basically looking real close at this diseased dinosaur bone. So this involved a histological analysis, which is what we refer to when we are studying the tissue of something, which in the case of fossils usually means bone tissue. Yay. This often involves cutting a cross-section of bone and then looking at it under the microscope and looking at what all the tissues were doing in different, useful for studying life stages, useful for studying growth patterns, but also useful for studying diseases. In this case, they looked at this dinosaur fibula and found that the bone structure was deformed, including some inflammations
which in the paper were described as dome-like inflammations of the bone.
Gross.
And I believe the article described the bone as having a bit of a spongy texture, which I think was referring to the surface, that you had all of this... The bone was wrong.
Laura talked about that when we did our paleopathologies episode.
Episode 84.
Yeah, she mentioned that it gets a spongy, just wrong look to it when it's diseased. Like, that's the best way to describe it. Just don't look right.
Which is not right. Based on the particular kinds of not rightness in the bone, they identified it as a case of osteomyelitis, which is a form of bone infection. And indeed, in the paper, they describe it as an aggressive case of osteomyelitis.
Not words you want next to each other in a sentence?
No, you don't want that. We see this in humans. This is well known in humans, and it often affects leg bones. Not just leg bones, but often seen in leg bones, like in this dinosaur. Osteomyelitis, like I said, bone infection, is often caused by microbes like bacteria. And they mention in the paper that this is one of a rare example of getting to look at exactly how the bone is acting during this disease, during this inflammation, this infection, not just in the fossil record where it is extremely unique, but also in general. That this is a cool study where we're not just able to look at how does this disease affect bone in a fossil animal, but how does this disease affect bone?
Yeah, it's now just another case study for this disease.
Which is pretty cool. But the headline-making part of this is that when they did their histological, their super up-close examination, they found that the blood vessel cavities are preserved in the bone. Not the vessels themselves, but the space
where they would have been.
Where the blood vessels would have been. And they identified about 70 unusual shapes within those cavities. These shapes were described as worm-like. They are each around 100 to about 600 micrometers long. So to put that in terms you can understand, 0.1 to 0.6 millimeters. So, picture that in your head. Which they tentatively identify as fossilized parasites.
Gross. I re-emphasize.
That they describe as being phosphatized. So these are mineralized parasitic remains. If that is a correct assessment of what these are, they did not identify them more specifically. So in the paper and in the article, they talk about comparing them to a group of ancient parasites that are known as Paleoleishmania, which are named as a reference to modern-day leishmania, which is what causes leishmaniasis.
Oh, okay.
Which are a group of protozoans, so not animals, not actual worms, but protozoans that are part of the broad group, the trypanosomes. So what that means is microbial organisms that often are known to cause disease. Now, as always is the case with something like this, we have these tiny little things. These authors describe them based on their shape and their chemistry as possibly being bone parasites, or blood parasites specifically in this case. However, there's always uncertainty in situations like this, and indeed the Scientific American article references a couple other scientists, at least one of whom expresses some concern. And the uncertainties are that, this could be wrong. Maybe these aren't parasites at all. Hopefully there will be more investigation. And I think, I believe that the authors have said they are wanting to look closer at these.
Yeah.
Number two, if they are parasites, we don't know what kind of parasite. So that might be exciting to learn in the future. Number three, not sure if this is an infection or if they got in after the death of the animal.
Yeah, that this is a step in the decomposition of a corpse.
Right. Although the authors note that there don't appear to be any obvious breaks in the bone where they may have gotten in there.
Okay.
So, it's a bit. And kind of along with that one, we don't know whether or not these little microbes are actually related to the disease.
Yes, exactly.
That they're seeing in the bone. Like, these could be a bone disease caused by a bacterial infection, and it also had these blood parasites in there.
Yeah, I've got bone disease and bloodworms.
Right.
Bummer luck.
You're just having a bad day.
Yeah.
But it's exciting implications, exciting findings. These could be the first report of parasites inside a dinosaur's vascular canals. And they could be the oldest occurrence of a bone disease associated with parasites. And even if all of that's, isn't the case, or even if that would get updated at some point, this is still a extremely unusual case of the description of a bone disease in a dinosaur.
That's awesome, and such a cool finding. I get the feeling that it would be easy to be like, well, of course it's hard to diagnose a disease for like an ancient animal, but we have difficulties diagnosing diseases all the time because, like you said, you could have a parasite that has nothing to do with the thing that's making you sick also.
Oh, yeah.
Or you could have a parasite that's causing the sickness there's so many variables, and now we're having to deal with the complexity of like a doctor's analysis on a giant ancient dinosaur.
Yeah.
Which is really, that's just neat. I like that a lot.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think I think they mentioned this somewhere in their paper, and I think I've read this elsewhere as well, that sometimes when paleontologists are trying to identify diseases in fossils, they run into the problem that the disease isn't fully well documented in living things.
Yeah, exactly.
That's like, oh, yeah, no, we're looking at this bone disease, but there isn't actually a lot of good understanding of what it does to bone today, which makes total sense if you consider, I'm sure there's tons of complexity to it, but the first thought that comes to my mind is, well, yeah, we're usually treating living people.
Yep.
And you can't take their leg away most of the time to study what is going on with this disease. So it's this interesting interplay where your fossil evidence actually can significantly contribute to the general knowledge of certain diseases.
Well, it allows you to do what we often herald paleontology for being able to do, which is it puts it in a long historical context of, oh, hey, that disease looks almost identical 80 million years ago. So that means these animals were experiencing very similar diseases that animals, and potentially us included, are experiencing today, which is a new perspective like that.
Oh, yeah.
That can completely rewrite our understanding of what this disease is and what it's doing and how it's behaving, and that's amazing.
Yeah, so if you think that's super awesome and you haven't already listened to episode 84, go listen to episode 84, because that's the whole episode is about that.
Yeah. Well, my first bit of news is about an ancient amphibian cousin that evidently was a lot like a chameleon.
Oh.
Yeah. So there's something super weird for you. This is research by Juan Daza et al. In Science, and the article is by our friend Riley Black in Smithsonian Mag. So this research is on a group, on a specific specimen of a group called Albinerpetontids, or albies.
Which is much easier.
Which is much easier, as many people have nicknamed them. These are extinct amphibians that have confused researchers for a while, because they are cousins of our modern-day amphibians. They're related to, the frogs and salamanders, but they have scales and claws, which are not features of our modern-day amphibians, and not commonly features we associate with amphibians in general, and makes them look actually very reptile-like. And no one's quite reconciled why, what that is and what they're doing with those weird features. They also have a long history. They range from the Middle Jurassic, so about 165 million years ago, all the way up until the beginning of the Ice Age, 2 million years ago.
Yeah,
so
long history.
Been around a long time. They're just super weird amphibians. Not very big, commonly just a few inches long, and have been kind of assumed to be terrestrial, ground-dwelling, maybe burrowing, so maybe kind of living like toads down in the underbrush. But we've not really had a great chance to study them in detail because their fossil record is very fragmentary. It's not a great record. Typically, the fossils are not particularly complete. So these are weird animals that we've not gotten a really good look at. Until now.
Oh boy.
This research is on 3 albi fossils from Myanmar, amber, almost 100 million years old, 99 million years old. And they have completely changed the view of them in many ways, particularly because of one very well-preserved skull that is in very good condition, has actually preserved some soft tissue, seems to be of an adult individual, and with these 3 and this really nice skull, it's painted a new picture of, instead of being ground-dwelling terrestrial animals, that they're actually probably arboreal, tree-dwelling, climbing around with those claws, and the preserved head had a bone known as the interglossal bone, which looks very similar to interglossal bones of chameleons, which suggests that it may have had the same firing tongue, projectile tongue as they call it, as today's chameleons.
Very cool.
So now they're being viewed more as amphibian chameleons, up in the trees, catching insects and small prey with their tongues, which is a complete inverse from what we had assumed up till now.
And what a cool convergent case where it's not just... Because I saw the headlines for this, and it was like, chameleon-like tongue. I was like, oh, okay, cool. There are a few animals that have projectile tongues that catch it, but also tree-dwelling.
Yes.
Like a chameleon. What a cool combination of convergent traits.
And for anyone who's wondering, the bone that is being described here, and that was the smoking gun for a firing tongue, the way chameleons' tongues work is that they are like a sheath over this tapered bone in their throat.
Right, which I think is part of the hyoid apparatus, which are our throat bones, which we have.
Yep.
But ours are not at all like a chameleon's.
No. And it just squeezes. The muscles of the tongue squeeze, and because the bone is tapered, that's what fires it off out of the mouth. Mm-hmm. And so they were able to find a similar structure that looks very chameleon-like.
Yeah, which I think is different from how frogs do it.
Yes.
It's not the same mechanism.
Yeah, well, because most frogs just their tongue is actually like almost hinged, and it just folds out.
Right.
There are certain newts that have like launching tongues like a chameleon, but I don't know how they do it.
Right. So this is specifically similar to a chameleon.
Exactly. So it's a very diagnostic feature, so much so that one of them was misidentified as chameleon initially.
Cool.
So very similar. These specimens are also detailed enough to identify them as a new species. They have enough new features, and they are preserved well enough that they have been given a new species name. The new species was named Yaksha peredii, and they were noting that it also had other features than just the tongue and the claws. The eyes are also forward-facing, which is good for targeting things. Now, chameleons' eyes are facing whichever way they want.
Right, all directions.
When they shoot their tongue, they're forward-facing.
Right, because that gives you that depth perception.
Exact, to lock onto a target. So, chameleon amphibians.
Very cool. It is always exciting to have a group of animals that we live with today that are super weird and unlike anything else.
Yeah, just bizarre top to bottom.
Very charismatic, unmistakable from anything else, one of a kind, to then discover
that this is 2.0.
Someone else had already did that. Which is great. And hey, if you want a whole episode about that, go listen to episode 70.
Yeah.
Convergent evolution.
Another cool thing about this finding is that they noted other similar interglossal bones have been found in other sites. Ooh. And now with this new specimen can be re-examined and might connect to other albies.
Right, not automatically a chameleon identifier now.
So now they have previous findings to review.
Very cool. Well, speaking of new species of super weird and surprisingly successful ancient groups, my next bit of news is about a new genus of multituberculates.
Okay, yeah, no.
I was researching this and I realized we may have gone 100 episodes and almost never mentioned multituberculates.
Which is particularly funny because of how many of their teeth I traced during grad school.
Multituberculates are this ancient, extinct group of rodent-like mammals. They are not rodents. In fact, they're not even mammals of any group we have today. They're not placentals. They're not marsupials. They are a outside group of mammals.
Their own group.
They were rodent-like. There's been about 200 species of them identified across the northern continents. Mostly they're known from their very strange teeth.
Yeah, real weird.
That's where the name multituberculate, is the tubercles on the teeth, are legion. Many of them.
Yes, no, that's the best way to describe it.
These ranged from mouse-sized to beaver-sized. They were around for a very long time. I want to say Jurassic to Eocene.
That sounds right.
Something like exceedingly successful group of ancient mammals that just don't quite fit within mammals today, but that are studied by tons of people. Like someone out there, I said we've maybe never mentioned multituberculates, and someone out there went, hey, wait a minute.
Yep. Or
now that you mention it.
They either did that and they went, no, you haven't.
yeah. Still waiting. We accept requests for episode topics all the time. This new bit of research is a new genus of multituberculates that also tells us possibly about their social behavior.
Oh, I'm on board.
This is research by Lucas Weaver et al. In the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, and we will link in the blog post to a press release in Sci News. These new multituberculates come from the late Cretaceous of Montana, around 75.5 million years ago, at a site called Egg Mountain, which is a dinosaur nesting site. Dinosaurs, but also mammals. Specifically, at least 22 individuals known from skulls and skeletons, which is exciting because,
that's cool.
Like I said, multituberculates, to my knowledge, are mostly known from teeth.
Yeah.
That was enough to characterize the genus and species, to describe what they all look like, to give it a name. This taxon, genus and species, has been named Phyllocomys primivus, and what's yet more exciting than that is not just what was preserved, but how they were preserved. The individuals were mostly found in small groups of 2 to 5 individuals. The groups included a mixture of mature adults, like fully grown adults, and young adults. Not just adults and babies.
Yeah.
This wasn't like parents raising their babies necessarily, but adults of different ages.
Adults and teenagers.
Adults and, in these little clusters, which the authors infer suggests we might be looking at social groups.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Also, the fact that we have a lot of postcrania, which is to say everything behind the skull, preserved, allowed them to characterize their arm bones, and they found that the features of the arm, particularly the joints like the shoulder and the elbow, are dig-worthy.
They were diggers.
They were diggers. So probably these were animals that were digging burrows. Like I said, these are rodent-like, so they may very well have been burrowers. So these authors are interpreting this evidence to suggest that we might be seeing communal burrowers.
Yeah.
That they were digging burrows, digging nests, digging dens, whatever you'd want to call them, and then a bunch of them would live there at the same time. Multi-generational social groups.
That's awesome. That's super cool. Because as you were describing it, and I was wondering if they would be diggers, because it started sounding like naked mole rats, which are like crazy social for mammal, but still they have the burrows with multiple rooms and like little groups. I started thinking of those compartmental burrows, and that's really cool.
Yeah. The authors point out that if this is a correct interpretation, this is the first example of social behavior in Mesozoic mammals.
Oh.
We don't have a lot of info on mammals from the Mesozoic. I believe there was a study that came out not too long ago about possible social behavior in proto-mammals.
Right.
I think Triassic or something like that. But this seems to be potentially our oldest known evidence of mammal social behavior. Which is cool because we don't know much about social evolution in mammals. We don't know when it arose. The authors make the point, I think it was in the abstract of the paper, that this is probably a highly variable trait. It's probably come and gone many times, which I totally agree with. But we don't know a bunch about it. And I think it's super cool that our first potential really cool bit of evidence comes from a group of mammals we don't have anymore.
Yeah.
A whole separate group.
Well, multituberculates are cool for that reason. They're one of the, and there's lots of examples of this, but the thing I always think of with them is they were around for so long and so successful during that time that it's actually kind of weird that they're not still here.
Yeah, it's weird something else took over.
Yeah.
It's weird that we have rodents.
Like that we almost had you interact with us, but you just didn't. And now you're just completely gone. And that's bizarre. And it's fun finding out that they had complex behavior potentially. Not surprising, that they were mammals.
Oh, yeah. And frankly speaking, they were animals.
They were animals. Like
this isn't uncommon.
Just because they were an unfamiliar group of animals. Yeah, of course there were some doing this. But that's a really cool way to find out about it.
Right? There's multiple clusters.
And I can't help but picture them just like curled up and cuddled together.
I believe there was some paleo art along with them that shows them all like bundled in a burrow.
And then they're buried alive.
Yes. as was their destiny.
Yes. Because as I've always said, the more tragic, the better the fossil.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
Boy, this is a good tragedy.
This is a great tragedy.
Very cool. Well, my last bit of news is about pterosaur diets.
I'm on board.
Right? Already good to go. This is a look at the dentition, an analysis of the teeth of different kinds of pterosaurs to try to get an idea of what they may have been eating.
Oh boy.
This is research by Jordan Bestwick in Nature Communications, and the press release is by the University of Birmingham. This research takes a look at the microscopic tooth wear of these pterosaurs. So tooth wear is the markings and scratches and rubbing on the teeth from eating.
Right.
The damage on the teeth, basically, from eating.
Right. Micro wear, all that, the little abrasions and everything.
Because that can give you a hint about, were you chewing something tough? Were you chewing in a particular way? You know, are all the scratch marks going in a certain pattern? That tells us how you might have been chewing things.
Yeah. And for any unfamiliar listeners, pterosaurs are the flying reptiles from the Mesozoic.
Absolutely.
Your pterodactyl and such.
Yep. And though there are toothless ones, many of them were toothed.
Yeah, which is the other important point. That a lot of the big famous ones were toothless, but there were lots of toothed pterosaurs. Hey, for more on that, episode 79.
Absolutely. This analysis looked at 17 different species of pterosaur and compared the wear on their teeth with wear analyses from modern reptiles.
Okay.
A variety of modern reptiles, they said, including things such as monitor lizards and crocodilians.
So cool reptiles.
Cool reptiles. The best.
Well, almost.
Oh, I mean, one of them's... Come on.
Komodo dragons are pretty close to snakes, you're right.
That's real close to your mosasaurs.
Also a good choice.
The analysis in the modern reptiles, basically what they were working from, is that rougher tooth wear indicated a diet of tougher foods, but particularly crunchy things. So like inverts, beetles, crabs, things with a harder exoskeleton that they were crunching through. And then less harsh, more mild tooth wear indicated softer foods like fish, meatier things with less that you're having to bite through. So that's kind of the trends they got from the modern reptiles, and then they applied that to the pterosaurs and found some interesting things. One of the findings that jumped out was the teeth of Rhamphorhynchus, a popular pterosaur that was about seagull-sized when it was full-grown, lived around the Jurassic period, long-tailed pterosaur, and often pictured with those like gnarly, jagged teeth sticking out of its mouth.
Yeah, that's the common interpretation. I don't know that that's... certainly the version that is often shown in movies and stuff.
Yeah.
It's a bit exaggerated.
Yes.
But yeah, they had teeth.
Yeah, they were toothy, and this analysis showed a difference in the teeth of juvenile Rhamphorhynchus and adult Rhamphorhynchus.
That's right, because this is one of the few types of pterosaur that we have lots of great specimens of.
Yes, we do. The juveniles, the younger specimens, showed that they showed the wear that matches with an insect-eating diet, a crunchier diet, while adults seem to be eating a softer, meatier diet, so potentially fish.
Oh.
So there is an ontogenetic diet shift from young to adult, which indicated to the researchers that the adults were not caring for the young.
Right.
The young were hunting for themselves.
Right. The adults weren't bringing this meaty food
to
the babies or showing them where to find it or anything like that.
The babies were hunting a different food source on their own.
Right. So this is like gators.
Exactly. So the babies hatch and then go off in our tiny Rhamphorhynchoids by themselves, and then as they get bigger, they shift their diet to an adult food source. This was also interesting for the researchers because one of the big questions that they were hoping to answer with this is, are pterosaur diets more comparable and lifestyles more comparable to reptiles or birds? Which has often been one of the big questions with pterosaurs. Like, which are they more comparable to?
Right.
And, for a big flying group, the other big flying group, famous big flying group, or other reptiles. And young that are going off and eating on their own is a more reptile trait than bird trait, if this tooth wear is indicating correct behavior. They also looked at diet trends for pterosaurs in general over their history. Pterosaurs were around for a long time, from about 200 to 66 million years ago, when all the cool things went away. And their analysis showed a general shift in diet during that time, with earlier pterosaurs eating more crunchy things, more invertebrates potentially, and then a shift generally, not every single one, not, exclusive, but generally toward a more meaty diet, fish and meat, softer diet. And that part of this shift seems to coincide with the rise of birds.
Okay.
And that as another flying group came in, that one interpretation is that as another flying group came in, pterosaurs started specializing in more meaty diets as they got bigger and shifted away from a bug-eating diet, which may have been being taken over by birds.
Right.
So this research has indicated a couple of neat things, both about behavior, but also about the overall evolution of the pterosaur group.
Interesting. Yeah, you said that the shift towards a meatier diet, and my first thought is that pterosaurs also got bigger. Mm-hmm. And when you're bigger, you're not sustaining yourself on insects and crabs anymore. You have to go after meatier, larger things. So although I've also, it has been suggested, as you pointed out, that the size increase by some has been suggested to possibly be in reaction to bird evolution.
Yeah.
Although that's difficult to know for sure.
Well, yeah, that's a hard thing to nail down as absolutely that's what happened. Yeah. Because that's but one factor that could cause you to get big or start eating meat.
Right. In a globe full of flying animals. But that's a very cool... It's we talked in episode 79 about how pterosaurs don't have a good time fossilizing. Mm-hmm. But because they were so abundant and so diverse, we have this really cool fossil record of them nonetheless, which allows us to do these... to study trends in pterosaurs, which is a really cool way to explore this group of animals.
Absolutely.
And I had never thought about people doing micro-wear on pterosaurs before.
Right.
I'm sure this isn't the first time ever that someone has thought to do it, but that's yet another fun way to infer diets and thus one of the core aspects of an animal's lifestyle.
Well, and I like when we get weird info, like, hey, the babies and adults weren't eating the same thing, evidently. Mm-hmm. And I like when those things pop up in these sort of studies, because you never know what behavior you might stumble upon while looking at what they ate.
Yeah.
So yeah, cool stuff.
Very cool stuff.
And with that, we're going to close out the news and get ready for our episode 100 topic. Woo. How did life start? Starting with, what is life?
Yeah.
So we're just going to answer that little question.
Just a real quick. Yeah, you heard it here, folks. Coming up, the definitive answer.
After the break, we will tell you what people think life might be.
For 3 small payments.
We will reveal the secrets. So life is a concept I think we're all pretty familiar with.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, I've had some experience.
The doctors tell me I'm alive.
Specifically 31 years experience with it.
And surrounded by it.
But life as a concept is actually much more difficult to nail down. What is life? What makes something alive? And that's a question we've been asking for forever.
Yeah.
Like, we've been asking it basically the whole time, and there's still no really perfect answer. Or at least all the answers have issues.
So this is hearkening back to our discussion in episode 98 of what a species is.
Yes.
And also our discussions here and then about what a fossil is. Yep. This is one of those that you know what is life and you know what isn't life.
That was a quote I found. You know it when you see it.
You know when you see it.
Sort of thing. We all know what we mean when we say life.
Right, but if you were to make a spectrum of things, like where on the line from human to bacteria to dust to rock, does it start being life?
Yep. And that question is still being actively debated to this day. And part of it's there's a philosophical aspect to it of we're trying to define something we don't fully understand. So our first section, we're going to kind of discuss what do we think life is, or how has it been described and defined.
Right, because if the big question of the episode, and indeed the big question in a lot of people's minds, is how did life get started? Before we can answer that, we have to know what are the features of, like, what defines life.
What do you mean by that?
Right, if we want to know how a fossil forms, okay, what is a fossil?
Yes.
We need to know what does that mean so that we can break it down.
Exactly, because if discussing the origin of life without having a term, a defined term to work off of, that's what we're going to do here. What is life, or what do we think it is? To start off, the things we know about life, and when we say life, we mean here on Earth.
Yep, all the life we know of.
Which is part of the discussion. That is something we're going to have to discuss. Life on Earth is broken up into 3 domains. The prokaryotes, which are your bacteria, and the archaea, or the extremophiles as they're sometimes called, which are the 2 groups separate from the one we're in. Both are typically single-celled. They typically lack a lot of the more complex, the features we think of with our cells. They don't have a defined contained nucleus that contains all their DNA. They don't usually have, like, chlorophyll, though cyanobacteria do.
Right. A lot of the organelles.
Yeah, the parts inside the cell.
Yeah, if you remember learning the parts of the cell in biology class, and it was like the mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum. I don't actually remember. The Golgi apparatus and all those things.
Yep.
Yeah, they're missing a lot of those things that are familiar in us.
Yeah, those structures. Those are found in the eukaryotes. Us, and all other life forms that aren't an archaean, sometimes called archaean bacteria, but archaea or bacteria.
Right. Animals, plants, fungi, and the vast assortment of things called protozoans.
Yes.
Or protists.
Yep. And these typically have, once again, complex cells in the fact that they have distinct parts. They have more parts and moving pieces inside them and are more defined. They also are often multicellular. Yep. That's the group that includes us with lots of cells working together. And this is the typical setup for life, the 3 domains. Though there are other interpretations, more recent research, as in like 2016, have actually suggested that we might have more of a 2-domain setup, where certain evidence shows that eukarya, our group, is actually an offshoot of archaea, and so it really should be bacteria and archaea and eukarya in 2 branches. So still the 3 distinct. It's not like we've just merged, but we're not on the 3 clear branches that we had always pictured. It might be kind of 2 branches with 2 groups in one. So there is even some debate as to exactly how related or not related, or exactly how these 3 domains interact with each other. And there are some clear features of life. Now, this is not telling us what life is, but what the life here on Earth all has in common.
Right.
And these are some that I'm sure are going to sound familiar to most of you. Every bit of life on Earth is carbon-based.
That's true.
All the life we've encountered is carbon-based, which means that carbon is the base element and makes up the majority of building blocks for the molecules used in life.
Right, our proteins, our amino acids, our genetic material. Carbon is the spine of a lot of these molecules.
Yeah, carbon is a fairly light element. It also bonds very well to a lot of things, including itself. So it's really good at building things, and it also interacts with chemical reactions very, very well. So it's good at doing different chemical jobs. And so all life we know of is carbon-based. And this has led often to the statement that, all life is likely carbon-based. Though I found one thing that said, for some people who think that saying all life is most likely carbon-based, like if we find it elsewhere, that is carbon chauvinism.
It's very carbon-based centric.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But all life we know of, carbon-based. All life we know of is also dependent upon water.
Yes.
It is connected to the water in some degree. Even life that lives in very dry places, there's water inside the cell itself, or it needs water in a more direct, like actually a pond sort of way.
Right. And it's important that when we're talking about life, that the way we're defining those different groups of life, like you said, is cellular.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about these requirements, a lot of the time it's not just like, oh, you need a habitat to live in where you can swim. Chemically, oftentimes, you are utilizing these molecules for what you're doing with your body.
It's just that we've yet to find any life that doesn't utilize water and isn't dependent upon water. So all life on Earth is intrinsically connected to water.
Right.
There isn't life without water so far that we've found. So once again, this is not us defining life. This is just the observations we've made about life. One of these used to be that all life needed sun energy. That sun was the base of all food chains, all food webs. But we've fairly recently, in scientific history, discovered that that's not true. We have found chemosynthetic organisms, things that live off of chemicals and need no energy from the sun, and the environments they live in are not fed by the sun.
Right.
And there's examples of this with bacteria living off of cave walls in pitch darkness, and then the famous hydrothermal vents at the deep sea, which were discovered in the 70s, so fairly recently. And these are effectively undersea geysers of heated ocean water that flows into the fissures of the seafloor, becomes super heated because it's reaching the molten earth, and then gets pumped back out at that hot temperature, pulling up tons of minerals and chemicals with it. And so you have these chimneys formed out of those chemicals, formed out of those minerals precipitating out of the geyser, and you get these structures pumping this stuff into the water, and there's tons of bacteria living in colonies on these chimneys.
Right. It's a natural source of heat and also all sorts of chemicals.
So that used to be, like, if you go find older books, it would list, and all life relies on the sun in one way or another. And now we know that that's actually not true. So we lost one of our big descriptors. So really, carbon-based needs water, and all life on Earth is genetic. We all have DNA. But those are just the things we've found as common. We still have trouble defining what life is.
Right. That's what all life we know of has.
Yes.
But we don't know if that is what all life needs. Like you said, we thought the sun was one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, so these are all the things that we've seen life doing. But when asked to go, okay, but what is life? It's all the things doing those things. But, what makes us alive and a rock not?
Right.
We all know the rock's not alive. You can ask anybody, and they'll tell you the rock's not alive, but why isn't it considered life and we are? That's an obvious one. It gets weirder as you look into some examples. It's also something that we didn't make up. So we're trying to apply a definition. It's the same issue we were talking about with species. We're applying a definition to a thing that we didn't invent, and we're now having to try to fit it to the words that we're applying to it.
Trying to put stuff in boxes.
We're trying to put stuff in boxes. So a lot of people criticize the attempt to define life, and that really what we should be aiming for is a theory of life. What are the concepts that dictate life, not how do we label it? One example that I saw given with this, which is a cool analogy, is what happened with water. Is initially water was described by its features, and things like it's wet, odorless, tasteless, and it quenches your thirst. But that doesn't only describe water. Right. There are other odorless, tasteless things that are wet that you could drink. So that definition describes water, but it does not actually encapsulate water alone. It wasn't until we got a molecular understanding of water and truly understood that it's H2O, that's water, that now we could say, what is water? It is H2O. We don't have the H2O for life.
Right, because I've seen descriptions where people will talk about, okay, well, what does life do? Life proliferates itself and operates on chemical reactions, and people say, right, so fire.
Yes, exactly.
Or you mentioned limestone. It's like, limestone requires water, it is built on carbon.
Yep.
What are the pieces that have to come together to make life? if there is such an answer
exactly
to that question.
The issue with this that one paper said was that we're trying to define natural kinds, which are concepts dictated by nature, not by us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, life is what it is, and now we're trying to define it, but we have only seen one example of it.
Right, and the reason we're trying to define it is because we're trying to find the border.
Yes.
We want the boundary. Where does it stop being life? Because that's where our question is.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the question of how life originates is going to be, is at the edge of the
when
definition.
Does it tip over?
Yep.
So let's go through a couple of the famous, more well-known proposed definitions for life. This is going to kind of just be a list that we'll go through quickly so that you can get an idea for what the variety has been. Some of these are much more commonly used nowadays, while others have kind of fallen by the wayside, but there have been a lot of attempts. One of the early ones was by Erwin Schrödinger in 1944, who said that life is a thing that avoids the decay into equilibrium, meaning that all things in the universe naturally, through entropy, chaos, want to just go into equilibrium with everything else around them.
Right. They break down, they
cool down, or they warm up.
Right.
To a level, equal energy level and state. Life actively avoids that by eating food and growing and taking energy in to avoid the death and decay into equilibrium. So it is something that is actively fighting against entropy.
Mm-hmm.
And the main tool of this is metabolism. It is taking in energy, metabolizing it, utilizing it as a living organism, and then eventually it does die, but it tries to avoid that by its nature.
Right. Metabolism, which is a term I expect we will talk about a lot.
Ooh, yeah.
Is the process by which any living thing, performs chemical reactions to sustain its own operations.
Exactly.
Using different molecules from the air, from the water, from food, or whatever counts as food for the organism we're talking about, forming chemical reactions that then allow it to move and stay warm and reproduce, etc., etc.
To keep going. Now that's a much more conceptual definition of yes, that's technically what it does, but also that doesn't really...
No, you're not going to get any points for that on the test.
Yeah, no. One of these, which is often called the Piceras definition of life, which is Piceras, and is an acronym that stands for what you will also sometimes see called the 7 pillars of life.
Oh boy. Which
is program, improvisation, compartmentalization, energy, regeneration, adaptability, and seclusion.
These sound like physicists.
Yes, right?
Describing what life is.
This was proposed by Daniel Koshland from the University of California, Berkeley, in 2002. So this is not an old
interesting
definition, but you will see this come up, or you'll see these terms used as here are all the things a living thing should have, even if they don't use the names, the term for this definition. I saw this pop up many a time. So very quickly, what these terms are saying is program refers to that life should have a program it is working off of. For us, that's DNA. That is the thing that tells life how to be life. It's what tells your cells to do what they're doing. It's what dictates how that life behaves or functions and survives. Improvisation is natural selection. That life should be able to adjust to changes by changing the program. The program should be able to mutate and adjust, with bad program being left by the wayside and good program proceeding on. Compartmentalization, it should be contained separation of spaces so that the living system is not just mixed in with the habitat it's in. You need to be a cell, not just water in water. Yeah, you have to be compartmentalized. Energy, all life requires energy. You need to take in energy to put off entropy, coming and getting you. You have to take in energy. All life needs that to keep going, to maintain its metabolism. Regeneration, it refers to basically general maintenance, but that could be healing from an injury. It could be regrowing your population, that if some of you die out, that you can continue to grow so that you're not going extinct, sort of thing. And it can be just normal maintenance for like aging. That as you're getting older, your body's still trying to keep itself going. That life maintains itself. Adaptability, which is not like adaptation as we think with evolution, it is adapting to the situation.
Right.
Which I think those two terms are kind of flipped. Improvisation should not be natural selection.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the same
adaptability.
thing.
Adaptability is behavior or chemical reactions to immediate situations.
Right. It's hot, I need to go over there.
Exactly. It's not changing the program. It's not changing your DNA, but you're reacting to the situation at hand. And seclusion, which is that your chemical processes are separate from the environment around you. That you're doing your own chemical thing inside yourself, controlled and separate, secluded from the outside environment. This is, like I said, these 7 pillars of life are very often quoted. You'll see them on lots of sites as like, you know, by the way, to be alive, you have to have one of the, you have to have these 7 things in some capacity. But this is but one definition, and there are criticisms. One of the biggest criticisms is that it's only descriptive, not predictive. This doesn't tell us, once again, this is telling us what life does, not why it is that way or anything. It does not include a theory of life. It is just describing the behaviors and functionings of life. So it's a list of descriptions, not actually, many of are not really actually a definition. Another very popular definition, and this is the one that I've probably seen noted most often as like the definition, or at least the definition most recently, is sometimes called the NASA definition or the Darwinian definition of life, or sometimes the chemical. I saw a couple of times. And this actually arose from a committee held by NASA in 1994 to define life. That was the goal of the committee, was to try to get an idea of how will we define life as we go out into the cosmos to search for life.
Yep.
One source I found said that this was suggested by Carl Sagan, like this definition, but I don't know if it was him alone who said it or if he like sparked the initial conversation. But this definition is a much simpler sentence that actually includes a lot from the list. That life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. So let's break that down really quick. Self-sustaining is that it is its own entity. And as was put in one of the articles I read, this was purposely put there to say that it does not need continuous input from a higher entity.
Right.
Be that a deity or someone caring and maintaining it.
Like the cell functions without another cell necessarily having to feed it or provide it with stuff.
Exactly.
Or something like that.
Chemical system is, the chemical is that it, that entails the metabolism, is doing the chemical reactions. The system is referring to the fact that it can be, it doesn't necessarily have to be an individual, that an individual thing, like one of our cells, isn't considered life, but the entire human is part of life. That something can be alive without defining life. And so that's what the system is implying, that it is bigger than just an individual example, but a living system. And then undergoes Darwinian evolution is that it has something, for us it's DNA, but something that it can pass on to future generations or incarnations that carries the information and can undergo changes that are passed on. So it has to be something that, like our DNA, can change, and then those changes be passed on and then be selected via natural selection for survivability. Doesn't have to be a DNA, but it has to be something that does that kind of job. A lot of people like this because, as they've described it, it encapsulates a theory of life. Mm-hmm. This theory applies to anything that functions this way, not just things we've seen our life do. And as they put it, this describes what we think life should have to be counted as life.
Right. Not
technicalities we've seen life do, which is the difference between the definition list style and this more conceptual, more theoretical style. But people have still pointed out there are still issues with it. It is still vague in certain ways that might make it break down. If a thing needs to be able to undergo Darwinian evolution to count, does that mean sterile individuals don't count? If you can't reproduce and pass on your genes, then you're not part of the evolutionary race.
Right. Are mules not
exactly
life?
And how can you determine something is evolving via Darwinian evolution?
Yeah.
Because if it's in the moment, you're only getting a snapshot. And even if you're looking at it, historically, how can you determine that it was undergoing what we consider Darwinian evolution? There's not really a good litmus test for that. So conceptually, it's more sound, but practically applying it, if we were to suddenly find an alien life form, how could we determine?
Right. Especially given the nature of this podcast, if we found a fossil
yes
or fossil evidence of what might be a living organism on another planet or something, we're missing a lot of that information.
Exactly. These definitions also become a bit more sticky when we look at the things that are close to the border or on the line. The classic is viruses, which have genetic material, do experience Darwinian evolution. They are mutating and they are and the mutations affect the next generation of viruses, but they aren't reproducing on their own. They have to have a host to reproduce. They need a host cell to make more viruses. So they aren't actually making more viruses. Other cells are doing that for them.
Right.
And they don't metabolize. They don't eat. They don't take in nutrients. One thing described is you could leave a virus in a room indefinitely and it's fine.
It's just a box of molecules.
Yeah.
That are activated in the presence of other life.
And that's exactly what one was saying, is that they're only behave similar to life when in the presence of life.
Mm-hmm.
So do they count?
Right.
And I did lots of research for this episode. So moving on, because no, we don't have, it's still debated.
And this is what one of the cool things about these definitions is that they get very specific.
Yes.
And we're talking about chemistry and the reason is because you have things like viruses.
Yeah.
Where you have the molecules that make up life, the molecules that make up living organisms are found in things that aren't living organisms.
Exactly.
And there's this hazy border. And yeah, viruses are the classic. Here's a thing that sure looks like life, but it's not acting like life.
Yeah. And I found about as many sources that seem to kind of lean toward like, no, I mean, they are, part of life. They're just real weird. And then others that were like, and, there's life and then there's things like viruses.
Right.
So we don't have a solid answer.
They're parasites of life.
Yeah.
Not like this is a parasite of bacteria and this is a parasite of caterpillars. They are parasites of life.
Life. It sounds like some Lovecraftian.
Yeah.
It feeds off of life. And then it also gets weird with like us humans who are kind of consistently and fairly effectively removing ourselves from Darwinian evolution. Like we're removing ourselves from natural selection by the way we live. And so at what point in the future are we going to have basically complete control over our health and our development and our genetic situation? Well, now do we not apply to that definition?
Right.
Or are we capable of it if we were to stop doing those things? So does it still count? Like, obviously we are alive, but does that definition of life now encompass something that has worked its way around having to do normal evolution and is now controlling its own destiny? This is the working definitions, but as we learn more, and if we ever find a second example, it's very likely the definitions will have to be grossly rewritten because we only have Earth. So speaking of Earth, let's talk a little bit about what things looked like at the beginning of life here on Earth. Not so much how did it get started, but what is our earliest view and what was Earth like back then?
Right. So life started on Earth at some point.
Yes.
The answer,
none of us are in denial that happened.
At some point, life got started on planet Earth. And before we get into the questions of how and why and what went into it, let's set the stage.
Yeah. When are we talking about and what kind of things might we be talking about? So to start with, let's look at least right now what our examples and potential examples of the earliest signs of life.
Right. We know what we might not have a solid definition for what life is, but we know what life looks like on Earth.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we know it when we see it, even if we can't all agree on how we should describe it.
Right. And we have, we gush over the fossil record all the time because, of course we do.
Yes.
One of the cool things about life is that life is connected.
Mm-hmm.
So historically, you can follow life back.
Yes.
And indeed, with our fossil record, we can follow the record of life back to get a sense of what the earliest life looked like. What does the most basic, simple, maybe, primitive, perhaps, oldest, primordial version of life, we should be, in the same way that we are able to trace back horses to go, okay, how did this get started? We can trace back the fossil record to go, okay, from the complexity we know today, back to when it was single cells, back to when life was at its earliest conception on the planet. What does that look like? What do we look for?
What evidences do we have? And we have a few that are fairly solid, and then a few that are more hotly debated. The one you'll typically see as like, here is our oldest fossil, though technically it's a trace fossil.
Yep.
Are stromatolites.
Yeah, stromatolites are these wonderful piled strata caused by life.
Yeah, it's what happens with a coral reef where they are depositing things and leaving it behind, and that deposit builds up and has left behind. And the things leaving these stromatolites, leaving these deposits, are bacteria.
Yeah, mats of bacteria basically laying down their bacterial cement generation after generation.
And now we have these lumps that when you cut into them, you can look at the layers of that growth and of that deposit. And the famous ones are in Australia and date back to about 3.48 billion years old. Billion.
Life goes back a long ways on this planet.
Yeah, the Earth itself is 4.5 billion years old. The Earth's been around for 1 billion years by this point.
Right. Almost every episode of this podcast has dealt exclusively with the last 500 million years.
Yes.
If it lasts 700 million years, gets you just about everything we've ever discussed on this podcast.
It really does.
This is 5 times older than that.
This is old. But this is really the oldest, undisputable. Like, everyone agrees, yes, this was left behind by life.
And part of that is helped by the fact that we have stromatolites still today.
Yeah, there's still bacteria doing this stuff.
Funnily enough, famously in Australia.
Yeah.
What is it? Emu Bay? Is it Emu Bay?
Oh, that sounds right. Yeah.
There's one or a couple of places in Australia where you can go see stromatolites.
And so trace fossils like that, something built or left behind by early life is typically what our fossils are. It's not usually that the bacteria itself fossilized, but it did a thing that then fossilized well.
Right.
There are a number of other examples that are similar in age, so still earliest evidences of life, that are a little bit more debated and critiqued. And some of these are actually fairly recent, like very recent. One that is also from Australia about the same time, 3.46 billion years ago, which was described in 1993, were filament-like fossils. So little thread-like fossils that once again seem like they might be the remains of a microbial mat. Mm-hmm. So like to think of microbial mats, it's like goo that would have just been covering the sea or pond floor. And a lot of these they think were getting their energy from sunlight.
Right. That
they are photosynthesizing. And they were it was a mat of goo that wasn't grass, but it was basically a little underwater lawn of just bacteria goop.
Yeah, kind of algae-esque is how I think about it.
Absolutely. And these filaments seem like they might be structures left behind by that mat of the growth of the bacteria, patterns from their growth. But some have argued that these structures look like they might just be mineral structures.
It's hard to tell. Was this caused by the growth of life, or was this caused by the growth of some minerals?
Because minerals grow.
They sure do, but they're not life.
But they're not life. And there was a paper that was describing why they aren't life, and one of the reasons is that if a crystal cracks during its time, you can reproduce crystals by scattering them, and they will grow into new crystals, but they don't carry over any of their flaws are not heritable.
That's right. They're not evolving.
They're not evolving, but they can grow and, depending on how you look at it, reproduce.
Oh yeah. And they're taking in chemicals from around them to help them grow.
So some people have said that those look kind of minerally. And then there were a couple of back-to-back findings starting in 2015. One was a discovery of graphite, which is a form of carbon, in a zircon, which we've mentioned before. These are some of the oldest minerals on Earth that we're aware of.
The oldest known minerals on the planet. These are extremely hardy minerals, and we have found a number of examples of super old terrestrial zircons.
Exactly, and this one dates back to 4.1 billion years old.
Yeah.
And the isotopes of the graphite, once again, a type of carbon, seem like they might be a biological type of carbon. Now, this type of carbon has also been associated with meteorites, so it's not guaranteed, but it's a suspicious bit of carbon.
Right.
So
possible chemical evidence of life.
Yeah, so this is the other thing we typically are looking for signs of life, are chemical traces, chemical footprints left behind by life doing their metabolism mumbo-jumbo in that area.
Yeah.
Or in that pond, that environment, and leaving behind things that shouldn't be there if something's not lifing it up in here. In 2016, there were fossils found in Greenland that date back to 3.7 billion years. And once again, seem like they might be microbial bacterial mats. These are also supported by the chemical analysis, which shows signs of life. And the researchers think that they are probably stromatolites.
Okay.
Just not as perfectly preserved as some of the more famous ones, but they show a lot of the signs, which would make them 200 million years older than the famous stromatolites in Australia, which was super awesome. And like the articles you'll find about those Greenland fossils were like, hey, new oldest fossils until 2017. When newer, older fossils came out. These are from Canada and seem to be fossilized microorganisms that date to either 3.77 billion years old or possibly 4.28 billion years old.
That's a big... I wasn't sure what you were leading to. Yeah. That's a big difference.
That's a big difference. So from what I got with reading the research, there's definitely debate as to which date is the more correct.
It sounds like maybe they're not sure what formation it's in.
Yeah.
Or maybe the dating is uncertain.
That's what it was sounding like. The dating has not come back with a really crisp time frame, which would make it still, even on the lower end, older than our previous oldest fossils, or really a lot older than them.
Way older.
These are small structures, micrometer scale, hematite tubes and filaments that seem to be microbial growth. The shape of these filaments are very similar to those found on modern hydrothermal vents by the bacteria growing there.
Okay.
There's even a little round clump with the filaments that is where the bacteria would have been attaching, like rooting down. Similar fossils have been found in younger rocks, so these are not the first of this kind. And the chemical analysis also supports that it does seem to be life. There's light carbons in the fossils, consistent with oxidized biomass, as I said. There are blobs on the rock, which have a compound called apatite, which form when phosphorus is released by dying organisms, often. And the rocks contain a few examples of organic carbons that are often released by bacteria. So, as they put it, it's very unlikely all of these features would be present without life living in this structure.
Right.
And it also matches heavily with hydrothermal vents, which many people have hypothesized could be one of the areas where life really got its first foothold, because it is such a unique environment that promotes that kind of bacterial growth.
Right.
But not everyone's convinced. Some people have said the filaments look too big for similar fossils and later fossils of that kind, that these are quote-unquote the wrong size. Others have also said that where these rocks would have been found, they think got superheated after their formation and would have scoured the fossils off, that the fossils would not have survived the heat that these rocks went through, and so wouldn't have preserved.
Right.
And then there's a couple who just think that the researchers made too many assumptions. So not everyone's happy, and this is definitely one of the more recent, very old fossil evidences. But life was around by at least 3.5 billion years ago, potentially a little bit earlier.
So the earliest life on Earth, we infer from all of our evidence, is microbial, right? Similar to bacterial, way before there's anything else. We have this evidence of somewhere in that 3.5 billion to a little over 4 billion years ago, where life seems to be cropping up. It's also worth pointing out that if we're finding evidence of life in different parts of the planet, it has already originated and spread.
Exactly. No one thinks that these times that we're looking at for these fossils is when life started.
Right.
That's when life was visible.
Well, it's where we have found it.
Yeah, exactly.
But this time period is generally where we're looking for when is life actually getting its start. So before we move into the questions of how did that happen, let's look at what the conditions were.
Yeah, what's the Earth doing during this time?
What was early Earth? If you were the first budding organisms 4 billion years ago, what kind of world are you being born into?
The sun is a deadly laser.
The sun is absolutely it is. Well, because that's going to tell us a lot about, right, asking the question of, oh, well, look out at this barren rock in a forest today. How could life originate? Well, that's not the conditions that life originated in.
Exactly.
So let's look back at a time period called the Hadean.
The Hadean, which that's a good name.
If you're thinking, hey, that sounds like Hades, you're right. The Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago. This is about the time the solar system formed. Basically, everything in our solar system is roughly that age. It all came together in the accretionary disk. That's another discussion. The earliest chunk of the geologic timescale, which is to say the first roughly 1 billion years, is called the Hadean Eon. It is preceded afterwards by the Archean. And within this early time period, we have very little evidence.
Yes.
Because, as we've discussed before, the farther back in time you go, the more likely the evidence has been lost. It's been subducted, or it's been eroded, or it's been covered up by new sediment.
Well, and as you were just saying, part of the reason we have the 4.6 billion year date is because we dated our sun.
Right, and we've dated asteroids, and we've dated other things in the solar system. That's actually a really good point. We do not have 4.6 billion year old Earth stuff.
Nope.
The oldest materials on Earth are zircon grains that have been dated to around 4.4 billion. But asteroids in our solar system cap out at about 4.6. I want to say moon rocks go back that way. The sun's a little bit older than that.
Yeah, the sun. We can age the sun based on its features and the kind of star it is. Yes. And based on the kind of star it is, it's about halfway through its life, which is 4.6 billion years old.
Right. And you can also, there are ways to measure the gas content of the sun and calculate. The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. We have very little evidence from those early days. Much of what we are studying is based on our limited samples.
Yes.
Bits of rock and mineral every now and then. And, as we were just saying, from other space stuff. Based on that info, we have been able to generally characterize these this early eon on the planet Earth, and it is called the Hadean because it was not a nice place to be.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be discussed here, but I'm just going to touch on a few of the main points. Probably the biggest one, the biggest difference that is often the first thing people will bring up, is the early Earth atmosphere.
Yep.
In the early hundreds of millions of years, the Earth's atmosphere was not at all like the atmosphere today.
Very alien.
It was probably mostly composed of gases released by volcanic activity. So in the early days of the Earth, there was tons of volcanic activity going on. This would produce what's called a secondary atmosphere, which is what we see on places like Mars and on places like Venus, I believe, where you have the planet is burping out its atmosphere.
Yeah, that's what the atmosphere was made out of. Earth farts, not microbe farts like it would later be.
Yes, later on, and of course the difference is that today's atmosphere is largely produced by life. We have a very oxygen-rich atmosphere today, which is unique among planets and bodies in our solar system. The early Earth atmosphere, based largely on what we know of other planets, probably had extremely little oxygen and would have been much more rich in gases like carbon dioxide, maybe methane, maybe things like ammonia, lots of water vapor, things like that, which would make it a very different environment to be in.
Chemically, it is just functioning very different.
Chemically, and in fact, you'll often hear it referred to as a reducing atmosphere instead of an oxidizing atmosphere. And the difference there is that in our modern atmosphere, the molecules in the air, predominantly oxygen, take electrons in chemical reactions, whereas a reducing agent gives electrons during a chemical reaction, and that might not sound like a big difference, but it dramatically changes what kind of chemical reactions are possible.
It's literally the opposite process. So
it sure is.
Makes a big effect.
So our early atmosphere, it's been compared, I've seen it compared to possibly being similar in composition to places like Mars or like Titan. The other thing about having a different atmosphere is that it wouldn't function the same way with space.
Yeah.
Predominantly, you were talking about that deadly laser.
Yep.
Our modern atmosphere does a whole lot of work at preventing radiation.
Effectively, we have a force field.
Blocking UV. To use a prominent example, one of our best shields around the Earth is the ozone layer. Ozone is made of oxygen.
Yes. That's O3.
O3. If we don't have an oxygen-rich atmosphere, we don't have that. So not only is the world chemically different in terms of the atmosphere, it's also being hit by lots of UV radiation. Speaking of radiation, there's also the point to be made that in the early days of our planet, the sun was different.
Yeah.
The sun was dimmer.
Yeah, it was younger.
So there was less light and heat coming in from the sun, but then on the other hand, our atmosphere was probably full of greenhouse gases that trap heat. There's also, there would have been a lot of radioactivity going on in the stuff making up the planet early on. I did, in my little bit of research, come across a couple of references to estimates for the temperature of the early Earth and the atmospheric pressure.
Ooh.
Because an atmosphere full of different stuff is going to weigh different amounts.
Yeah, it does.
Now, I'm not going to go into details there because I did not find enough to have, like, solid things to say about it. But suffice it to say, yeah, the temperature was different and the pressure that you experience at the surface of the Earth was probably different.
Yeah, well, it's not only standing on what the surface was like at this point back then would have been different in the fact that you would have needed a suit. Like a environmental spacesuit to breathe and survive, but also it would have felt different. It would have been, the air would have been pressing on your body differently.
Yes.
Just due to what it's made out of.
A person in this atmosphere would not survive.
So, alien planet.
And speaking of where you would stand, just very briefly, there is debate as to when oceans started.
Yep.
And when continents started.
Yep.
There is evidence for water going back. I mean, some of those early zircons show evidence of having been formed in the presence of water. So we know that there were bodies of water going back a good ways. And then by around the end of the Hadean, we would have had oceans.
Yes.
We know that there was continental landmass eventually. But in the early days, in the earliest days of the Earth, not only was there very little, but how stable it would have been is uncertain and up for discussion. Eventually, we would have had oceans, but very little continental mass, because it isn't until a little bit later that plate tectonics really gets started. So, like, the rules of the planet were different. You wouldn't necessarily have had a place to stand, or a place to even swim safely on this early planet. And then, of course, there's the other thing that is extremely famous about this time period, particularly the late Hadean, starting around 4.1 billion years ago and then going to about 3.8, which is about the time we're looking for when life may have started. If you did have a hazmat suit to protect yourself from temperature and radiation and pressure and breathing, and if you did find a solid piece of land to stand on, you're liable to get hit by an asteroid.
Yep.
Because this is during a time period that is often known as the late heavy bombardment, which is a time where the Earth and indeed most of at least the terrestrial planets were under a much greater than today assault barrage from space stuff. And the way that we know this is because this is the time period where the moon got most of its craters.
Hey!
Because those craters aren't preserved here on Earth, but we see this evidence from elsewhere in space that this was a time where there was tons of junk floating around in the solar system that would have been constantly, compared to today, very commonly hitting the planet. And every time you have one of those land, you're going to be producing damage and heat. And if it's big enough, you're throwing chemicals and stuff up into the air, possibly globally or in wide ranges.
It's possibly out of the air, into space again.
So this is a time period where there's lots of volcanic... The earth underneath your feet is erupting. The air above you is dropping bombs. You can't breathe. You, like us.
Yes.
There's no oxygen. The atmosphere chemically is different. The pressure, the temperature, there's no place to stand. Like, this was not at all like the Earth we see today. So, and this really makes it that much more complicated when we're trying to ask this question of, oh, well, how does life get started? It is very difficult to find a place on Earth today that shows us what early Earth would have been like.
Yeah, that mirrors it at all.
So even if we could do some sort of experiment and see like, oh, well, we found out how life might originate in the desert. Okay, but that's a wholly different environment.
The rules are all out the window.
Than this veritable hellscape that was the first 500 million to 1 billion years of the planet Earth.
Yep.
Which is why so much of the discussion of how life may have originated is reliant on studies of other celestial bodies.
Yeah!
Other moons and other planets, because, yeah, Titan over by Saturn might be a better example of the conditions that Earth life started in than Earth is today.
Yeah. Whenever the question seriously is asked of what might alien life be like, that's a entirely impossible question to actually answer because we don't have any clue. Like, there's so many factors.
Yep.
What is their star like? What is the planet like? How far away is it from that weird star? Like, so many things. We can't anticipate what the life's going to look like there. That's almost kind of what we're having to do with our own planet.
Yeah. This is not a recognizable place.
We're being asked to visualize what life was like on a planet that was effectively not our own.
And which also doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, it's gone.
That planet has dramatically changed. And ironically, the major reason why it has changed, particularly when it comes to the composition of atmosphere and ocean where all life tends to live, is because there's life there.
Yeah, because it was terraformed by the life that somehow came to be.
Which is funny because terra means Earth, and if the planet was terraformed by life to become Earth, what was it before?
Ooh, the Earth before the the Earth that was. It's all like Firefly now.
And that's the other really important point, and this kind of gets into another question that we may bring up later, which is that the chemistry of the Earth today is intrinsically built on life.
Exactly.
Our atmosphere is a life-rich atmosphere. The reason we have an oxygen-rich atmosphere is because of life.
And that really is one of the core paradoxes that the answer for how did life come to be is dealing with, is the fact that all the life we know today functions in a world run by life. So there is no life today that functions without the existence of other life around it. So we have to try to figure out how these systems came to be without these systems being in place.
Right. It's like looking at a very complex machine where all the parts that have been built upon each other and now everything works together.
Yeah, it all relies on each other part.
And if you pull out a cog, it all falls apart, but it didn't start that way.
Exactly. And so we'll look at what are some of our ideas for how that machine could have been built after the break. So before we dive into what are some of our proposals for how we can go from a world without life to a world with life, let's talk about what is the concept we're actually discussing. The concept of the origination of life is known as abiogenesis.
Yes.
Going from inanimate to animate objects.
Right. Whatever that means.
Yeah, going from things that are not alive, chemicals, minerals, things that are not life, somehow life has to come from those. And that process is known as abiogenesis. That's the term we've given to it. Mm-hmm. You'll often see this, though, called origin of life, or OOL.
Ool.
Ool. So you'll see it as big O, little o, big L.
There's no P in it.
Yep. And so the origin of life, abiogenesis, is this process of going from a purely inanimate world to suddenly having living, metabolizing, evolving things. Now, another term you'll see associated with the origin of life a lot of the time is LUCA.
L-U-C-A.
The last universal common ancestor.
So we talk on this. So the title of the podcast is Common Descent.
Yep.
Which is a reference to the fact that life comes from common ancestry. And we talk about this all the time, where it's like, oh, well, there was a population, a species that gave rise to all the mammals, that gave rise to all the tetrapods.
All these snakes, all these bugs.
LUCA is the species, the population, the thing that gave rise to life.
So those domains we talked about at the beginning of the episode, the eukaryotes and the prokaryotes, the bacteria and the archaea, when you go down to where those domains branch from each other, that's where LUCA is.
Right. And LUCA, we should point out, is a hypothesis.
It's a hypothetical, conceptual ancestor.
That should have existed.
Because all of our evidence shows that we're related.
Yep, that life is monophyletic. Right? Life arose this one time and we are all descended from it. Or at the very least, all life today...
descended from one source of life.
Descended from one source, and that is the first ancestor. Mm-hmm. That group is the first ancestral microbial mat, or whatever,
yep,
that all other life derives from.
And it is good to know that LUCA may very well not be the origin of life, and a lot of scientists assume that it is not. That life probably originated before LUCA, and that LUCA may not be a direct line from that original origin. That life could have popped up, those lives could have gone extinct, and other life popped up, and LUCA is the one that led to all the life we know now.
Right. A great comparison to it might be, go back to episode 37 about birds. All living birds have a common ancestor that is not the first bird.
Exactly.
Because there were other more, right? You had the earliest birds, and they gave rise to a bunch of different types of birds, and then among that early bird diversity was the ancestor of all modern birds. Mm-hmm. So you could have had a diversity of early life forms, either all unified, all together, or multiple patches.
Because we're talking about life originating, so we don't know that it couldn't have happened multiple times.
And somewhere in there should be the population that was successful enough that it gave rise to prokaryotes as we know them and eukaryotes as we know them.
Exactly.
That's LUCA.
Now, as you said, LUCA is conceptual. It is a hypothetical ancient ancestor, but there are some things that we potentially know about what this ancestor might have been like. So we don't have a fossil, we don't have solid physical evidence, but if it is the ancestor to all life, we have all of our DNA.
Yeah.
And we can look at the things we all share, all we life share with one another, and potentially, hypothetically, theoretically, if it is shared across life, it very likely or very well may be from Luca, from our shared ancestor.
And this is how we interpret common ancestors in all different groups of life.
Exactly.
The earliest monkeys, the earliest horses. We can do that with, okay, well, let's look at the traits we have today.
Everyone that should have come from it.
Yep.
And what do they share?
What we make an ancestral state reconstruction.
And so we've done that with Luca. They've made a few attempts with differing techniques. The first one was what genes are shared across all genomes, all life DNA, effectively. And 30 genes were identified that should have belonged to Luca, which is not enough to really tell us anything.
Yeah.
That's not actually enough to tell us anything about Luca, but that those are shared due to ancestry.
Right. Luca had at least 30 genes.
Yes, exactly. Another one said, okay, what genes are found in at least a member of both the eukaryotes and the prokaryotes, the two,
right,
the two major groups of the three domains, and 11,000 were identified that potentially could have belonged to Luca, which most people say it's not likely all of those did.
Right.
That's too big a number for all of them to be hits. And this is messed up by lateral gene transfer.
Sure is.
Bacteria and archaea can trade genetics between individuals just to be like, here, put that in your genome. Yeah. And here, incorporate this into your biology. And there are even examples of it happening across domains. So how widely the commonality of some of these genes are likely not due to ancestry, but due to sharing.
Right.
Due to lateral gene transfer. So the most recent attempt took a similar look, but with more caveats. They tried to look at genes that could only be determined to not have been shared via lateral gene transfer, that showed all the signs of not being shared that way. They had to be present in at least two groups of both archaea and bacteria. Mm-hmm. And using this was in 2018 that this study happened, they whittled that 11,000 down to 355.
Cool.
Which is a much more usable number. And because of how strict they were, they likely cut out more than would actually be hits for Luca. So this is actually probably smaller than the number of genes that are from Luca due to their over-avoiding lateral gene transfer. But this small number could also be due to a simpler genome, that Luca may have had less genes because it was early life. But the genes that they found were actually able to tell us something potentially about how Luca lived. Ooh. Which is one of the coolest sentences I've ever gotten to say on the podcast. The genetics of Luca that we have identified with this analysis are similar and show that it would have used molecular hydrogen as its energy source, which makes it very similar and comparable to bacteria on hydrothermal vents.
Interesting.
So the current evidence shows that Luca was either living on a hydrothermal vent or living in a very similar extreme habitat to a hydrothermal vent.
Right.
So Luca, and this is not a huge surprise because those vents have been pointed at as like that sure does seem like a good place for life to start and for like ancestral life to start. But we now have what seems to be genetic support.
Very cool.
Which is so awesome.
Very cool. Yeah, you mentioned early on that a lot of archaea or archaea are called extremophiles because they live in extreme conditions. And it should not come as a surprise, given what we said about the early Earth, that we often look to extremophiles to see how life might survive in the early days because that was extreme.
Exactly. Now, we don't have an age for Luca. We estimate that Luca probably would be found somewhere between 2 and 4 billion years old, but we don't know. And a lot of people do not consider that Luca is the first origin of life.
Right.
So this term will come up when you look up origin of life a lot of time, but it is not actually answering the question, how did life start?
Right. It's similar to, I've seen this come up when people talk about mitochondrial Eve.
Yeah.
So this is this idea that came up several years ago where a group of researchers looked at all human genetics and traced the maternal lineage back to a common ancestor, like a single individual whose genes became spread through the population, and then so on and so on, as mitochondrial Eve. And I see this come up misinterpreted from people suggesting this is the first human.
Yeah, like we found the first human being.
That person lived in a population of humans. It's just that they're the only one of that population whose genes survived to today. Yeah. Luca's like that. Luca almost certainly lived in a population of early life, and all the others genetically are not around anymore.
Exactly. Well, it's like we have a coelacanth today, but that's not what the earliest coelacanths were like.
Right.
This is the one that made it. Luca is the only one that left behind today's lineage of life.
Right.
But for all we know, there could have been a variety of early originating life forms. So now, let's take a look at that question. How, the true question of abiogenesis, how can life come about from no life? That's really the core. How does it come to be? And there are a couple of key things that people look at when trying to answer this question. Many of them are very chemistry heavy, so we're not going to be diving into all of the chemical analyses, but there are a few major components that today seem pretty much to be necessary for the life we know. And these are the building blocks of life, literally. One is lipids, which are key in the cell membranes of life we know. Carbohydrates, which make up sugars and cellulose. Amino acids, which are important for protein metabolism. And nucleic acids, which is DNA and RNA.
So these are the biomolecules that seem to be the core.
The building blocks and tools of life. And one of the big issues is that, like we were saying earlier, a lot of these in the current biochemistry need the others to function. So, for instance, our DNA is the biological molecule that holds the information to tell our cells what proteins to make. But DNA and RNA cannot copy themselves, duplicate themselves without the help of proteins.
Yep.
That they made. So, chicken or egg. Which one made the first? Which one was being used by the other? Like, you can't have one without the other in the way life works now. And as far as we can tell, none of these will do the jobs that we see them doing in life without the fatty lipids to create the cell membrane. So if you don't have that membrane, you can't have life. But protein-based enzymes are needed to produce that membrane. So we have these parts, these key integral parts that are building each other and helping each other function in the way life works. But that can't have been how it was working before life happened.
Right. This harkens back to episode 68. We talked about the evolution of eyes.
Yes.
And this is another famous example of this, where when people first started to ask this question of, well, how did eyes evolve? Well, eyes as we know them today are very similar. All the parts are working
super
together
complex
and relying on each other. And what we have found, and this is the case with so many evolutionary stories, is that in the early days, it wasn't functioning the same way.
Yes, it wasn't doing the same job, or it wasn't doing the job in the same way at all.
That the functioning has changed to produce what we see today. And this has a similar... we can't get an answer if we limit ourselves to thinking of them as functioning the same way they do right now.
Exactly. And so that's one of the big questions. And I saw it stated in one of the sources that any respectable, any reliable, or any hypothesis for the origin of life that should be taken seriously needs to address the origin of these building blocks. If it doesn't, then it can be thrown out the window, because this is really the key, the linchpin. Biological molecules. How did they come to be without biology? Now, one of the kind of easiest answers, and one that you will see very often, is that they came here ready-made from space.
Right.
This is called the panspermia hypothesis. And it speculates, the older versions of it speculated that life itself was seeded on Earth from space, from and other planets or other bodies.
Bacteria rode an asteroid, crashed here, and now we have life.
Like the dude from Dr. Strangelove. Just down into the ocean. And this is an old idea. This goes back to a Greek philosopher, Anaxagoras, 500 BC, that first suggested life was seeded on Earth from elsewhere in the universe. And so this has been around for a long time. It's kind of an obvious answer of...
And also a non-answer.
And it is, how did life start on Earth? It didn't.
Right.
You know, that is a valid thing to look into.
There are cases of asteroids on Earth, meteorites on Earth, that came from Mars.
Yes, we have Martian
for
meteorites.
example.
Yeah. And we do have meteorites that come down with organic compounds.
Yes.
The same compounds we're looking for, but not necessarily formed by life, because they can be formed in other ways, as we'll go into. So this is a hypothesis that is not typically considered viable by most, especially in the form that life was brought here. A more modern take on it is that the building blocks, that meteorites with amino acids, meteorites with nucleic acids, meteorites with some of the more complex proteins came down, and that the reason they had them is that those things were able to form in space in a different way than they might form naturally or without help here.
And we have found certain biomolecules on asteroids.
Absolutely.
That has been seen.
Because things in space are constantly being bombarded by cosmic radiation from stars. So there's lots of energy to catalyze and to jumpstart reactions, chemical reactions.
And that's an important point, is the ingredients of life are found in non-life.
Exactly.
Like the elements, the molecules, the compounds that we're looking for are often formed outside of life.
So this is a hypothesis that is, if you go Google origin of life, there's going to be a section on this. Mm-hmm. Like, it is still discussed because we can't rule it out, because we are finding that there is indeed biological style molecules coming down on rocks from space. We do see planetary debris from Mars coming down to Earth, so the possibility that we're getting stuff from other planets is very real. As we were mentioning, a lot of other planets in a lot of other bodies in the solar system have similar features to what early Earth had, so it's not like it's impossible that stuff could be growing there or could have grown there at some point. And there is evidence that, like, we have done tests with microbes in space, and there are things that can survive. So it is not quite as silly as it sounds when first stated, but basically there's not a lot of professionals and researchers who take it as a serious option.
Right.
Or at least as a major player. Like, we may have been, meteorites may have definitely played a role in the chemistry of Earth, but that it's not the source of our building blocks of life.
Right. And even if that was something that ended up being, a version of that ended up being accepted, it still doesn't answer the question of how life begins.
Exactly.
That might answer how it got here. It might answer how we got some of the pieces we needed.
But it still had to start somewhere.
But we still have to get that question of how does it begin? And yeah, most scientists investigating this question do operate under the inference that it happened here on Earth.
Yes.
One way or another.
Exactly. So we are mentioning it because it is part of the discussion, but we are definitely also wanting to make sure we don't oversell. It's a cool sounding possibility, but it is not the one that most people are looking to for the answer, because it also has a lot of issues with it, and there's no hard evidence for it. It just makes sense based on certain evidence, but there's no actual evidence for it having happened. So it's missing actual clues. The modern hypotheses for how life started here on Earth really are all kind of building off of a quote from Darwin. Not super surprisingly. In 1871, it was a letter to Joseph Hooker where he said, and I quote, "But if, and oh, what a big if," in parentheses, "we could conceive in some small, warm little pond with all sorts of amino and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc., present, that a protein compound was chemically formed ready to undergo still more complex changes." That could have been. This was the quote that he was given when referring to how life could have started. Mm-hmm. And this is really where the primordial soup originates from, is that idea. And all in all, this is kind of what most of the hypotheses are working off of, is some idea, typically more complicated than this single statement, but that, yeah, a aquatic environment with the right ingredients and the right energy source could spark the combination of a simple structure that could then become more complex as chemical reactions continue.
Right.
And that's the basis. That's kind of what the thoughts are, is that life did not go, but that some protein or other organic structure was built just by chemical reactions happening with all the right things being in the right spot together. And then as those reacted with other things, it took a step closer to being a more lifelike thing. And then a step closer with another additional reaction. And that eventually it took on lifelike qualities.
Right. And much like when we talk about the evolution of different forms in life as we know it, this would have been an early planet rife with chemical reactions happening everywhere, and then some of them produce something that's a little bit more like life, and then those are reacting potentially in all sorts of different ways, and then some of those undergo a reaction that makes them a little bit more, and
exactly.
It's just lots of experimentation in the chemical stews of early Earth.
And this step-by-step proposal was really set out in the 1920s by the Russian scientist Alexander Oparin and the English scientist J.B.S. Haldane, who proposed the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis, as it's known, which is that step-by-step, and is also where the term primordial soup was coined, I believe.
Interesting.
And it was built off the idea that if you could get some sort of polymer versus a monomer, so a group of molecules that could replicate itself, you're on your first step to now it is perpetuating itself. It's building more of itself, and now it can go on to become more complex. If it's just happening randomly, that's not really going to lead us to a more complex life. We need something that can build more of itself via interacting with the chemicals around it. And so that was really the initial step that is proposed, that they were proposing. And between Darwin's suggestion, them fleshing it out a bit more, this is really kind of, we haven't moved away from that idea since then. Now we're arguing about what those first polymers were, those first molecular structures, and how did certain ingredients come about. So that's really where the debate now is. One of the most famous experiments looking at how the primordial soup became the primordial soup was the Miller-Urey experiment in 1953.
Very famous.
Yes, many people, you might have heard this, especially if you're remembering back to your intro biology classes, because that's where I remembered I first heard about it. This was a direct attempt to try to investigate the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis and Darwin's initial idea of this warm pond with all the ingredients inside it. So they set up a system that had a container full of water to represent the early ocean. It was connected to glass tubes, one which contained ammonia, methane, and hydrogen, which are mixtures that during that time is what we believed the early Earth atmosphere and general chemistry to be, to represent. This was representative of early Earth's chemistry. A flame that would heat the water to send water vapor up through the tubes to mix with everything, and then an atmosphere flask, so another open one with electrical sparks to simulate lightning to kick off the chemical reactions. And then they let it run for a few days, just reacting, doing whatever it was going to do. And sure enough, the water started to turn a deep red. And as one description I saw put it, became a broth of amino acids.
Ooh.
Which seemed to, undeniable evidence that, yeah, these organic building blocks can form with just natural reactions.
Right.
Lightning and other energy sources could absolutely be part of it.
Right. You don't need already living things to produce these amino acids.
Exactly. So we could have the formation of the primordial soup in a non-life environment, in a non-life Earth. But there are some issues. This was the first attempt at this.
Oh yeah, this was 70 years ago.
So there are things that have been changed and things that were wrong. One of the big parts is we don't think the atmosphere was like that anymore.
Right.
So the premise that they were working under when simulating early Earth is incorrect, which seems like a real big blow to the experiment, except people have done their own versions of this experiment over and over again over the years. Like, this was not the only... It's the famous one because it was the first one, but people have been doing similar tests with the updated knowledge and updated chemicals and gotten very similar results, which actually goes to show what the evidence seems to be showing, that these super important building blocks of life can actually be formed kind of readily. Like, they're actually not that hard to form, and they can form in multiple situations with multiple ingredients present. So it's actually not that big a deal?
Yeah, these don't just show that it's possible to get amino acids and the like from natural environmental reactions, but that it's quite possible.
Yeah. And there have also been tests that have looked at other energy sources. So there was one that used pressure boxes to simulate deep ocean, hot environments like hydrothermal vents, and were able to do similar things. They were able to produce certain amino acids and even sugars and a couple of other organic molecules.
Cool.
So it doesn't just have to be lightning. The Earth would have been, according to these experiments, producing the building blocks of life just by doing what it was doing. Ow. So it seems the answer for, but how did these structures come to be, is not as difficult to answer, or not as impossible as it first seemed. Now the more heavily debated question is, what was the first replicating thing? What was the first thing that came together of those organic compounds to start kind of behaving like life? And there's two main camps that think that basically disagree on what the first step of life was. One is the metabolism first hypothesis, which posits that organic metabolisms needed to be established before we could start getting the other things like genetic material and those other organic compounds coming around it, that we needed the chemistry of life happening first, and then the other stuff could build up around it. The other is the genes first hypothesis, which says that genetic material was the first building block that started showing lifelike stuff, and everything else kind of came up by happenstance. Metabolism was a side effect of these early gene quote-unquote organisms from just their natural behavior or natural functionings. The other interesting thing about these two hypotheses is that they were both kind of championed by Oprin and Haldane, respectively.
Oh, interesting.
Oprin focused more on the metabolism, while Haldane focused more on the genetics. And that's where their hypothesis diverged. And the metabolism first hypothesis basically is working under the idea that naturally occurring chemical reactions, and metabolic reactions, the same reactions that are happening in life-like metabolisms, could have formed naturally in certain environments. And they point to hydrothermal vents, where a constant source of chemicals and minerals are being pumped out that could feed these reactions without the life form seeking them out. So you could have consistent, continuous metabolism reactions going, and there's, the outside source is the vent, or something like the vent, and that these could become self-sustaining that way, through that process. And then, as they were happening, they could produce molecules that could act to catalyze more complex reactions and more complex processes that then would take these bundle of compounds that are just reacting to a more complex metabolism, a more complex chain of reactions. And eventually, they might be able to start building actual large complex structures because of the chain of reactions, and form proteins and things like proteins and nucleic acids that then could start doing more similar life stuff, as we see them doing in life today. And that eventually, if you got, and as they put, quote unquote, individual that gets encapsulated by some of these compounds and forms a membrane, now the metabolism's happening in its own environment.
Right.
and now we have a early proto-life form.
Right, now you have a proto-cell.
Exactly.
It is a bundle of chemical reactions closed off as much as it needs to be from the outside world.
Exactly, which goes back to our list definition of life, that seclusion.
Yep.
And compartmentalization, that it's functioning under its own chemical reactions, not as just a part of the environment. And there is some evidence that structures like this, non-genetic structures like this, can pass down changes that happen to their structure to the next replicated structure, the next replicated set of compounds, that if something changes in this one, it can pass that. So there is a sort of hereditary, generational reproduction going on, kind of. So basically, you don't need DNA to carry information, necessarily. But there are some major criticisms. One of the biggest ones is that there seems to be a limit to the complexity of structures like this, that eventually they cap out, which means they can't continue to evolve, because that's how they're changing, is by becoming a more complex reaction. So that there does seem to be a limit to which they can actually evolve under Darwinian evolution. Now, this gets into the chemistry aspects, which even I don't fully understand. But a lot of people are unsatisfied with how far it seems these sort of structures could have developed, and that it doesn't seem like they could go far enough or continue long enough to be considered living.
So this idea is that you end up basically with that bundle of metabolizing things that might even have its own version of chemical reactions influencing the reactions down the line.
Yeah, that there is kind of a passing down the generations of information.
Right, and then from there you would potentially move on to a more complex reproductive method.
Yeah, that this process will eventually build genetics.
Right, that you have a kind of not reproducing cell doing its metabolism before you have something that is reproducing later on.
Yes, and so this is sometimes called like the chemistry focused hypothesis. This is focusing on the chemistry of the cell before the other aspects of the genetics and the evolving aspect that we are so familiar with life today. The genes first hypothesis is the one focusing on that. That posits that all of those chemical reactions will come as a side effect of a genetic evolving structure. As it is able to interact with the environment, it will start to create those chemical reactions and those metabolic processes just step by step. And so that the metabolism is actually secondary. This was proposed though Haldane was the one who leaned more the genetic route, the actual genes first hypothesis was proposed by a number of researchers in the 1960s. And then in 1986, the term RNA world was coined.
Heard of that.
And that is really, because there were other ideas of what aspect of genetics were the first genes, but nowadays it's pretty much, in this hypothesis, agreed that RNA was most likely the first genetic material to start this process of abiogenesis. And for anyone who doesn't remember, RNA, ribonucleic acid, is a very similar structure to our DNA, except while our DNA is a double strand helix, which means it has two sides spiraling around each other, RNA only has one of those sides. It's basically half a strand of DNA, and it does different jobs in the cell. In our cells and most life cells, it can still carry genetic information. Like, it is still genetic, but it's not doing the job of our DNA, which is instructing everything to do the jobs it's supposed to do. RNA actually does some of those jobs. It plays a major role in catalyzing reactions inside the cells. So catalyzing meaning sparking and getting the reaction to happen. And one of the important jobs it does is synthesize proteins. It is a big part in building and putting together the proteins that our bodies and that biology needs, and that the DNA is telling the cell to make. So basically, the idea here is that RNA, doing many of the jobs that it does in cells today, was what our first reproducing, self-replicating, not organism, but biological entity was.
Right. You could get a handful of these nucleic acids, these compounds, that have the ability to carry information, but also are reacting to synthesize things.
Exactly. And that was one of the first questions was, okay, RNA is great and all. It's made out of nucleic acids. How did they come together in a chain without being put together by a cell, which is how it's typically done? And there was an experiment in the 1950s by Sidney Fox and his colleagues that found that amino acids, if heated with outside of water, could actually link up. So if they were heated out of solution, they could form nucleic acid chains. Oh, sorry, no. They could form amino acid chains and basically become proteins. So they suggested that if something like if some water splashed on like a lava flow or something, that could flash evaporate and heat that mixture, so you could get proteins happening that way, which could then act as the enzymes to help nucleic acids start forming together. And RNA nucleotides have been found to be able to form together when exposed to certain clay surfaces, that the clay acts as a catalyst, as a binding site that lets them link together.
Right.
So there are natural ways for both the enzymes critical for the nucleic acids to function and for the nucleic acids to link up.
Yeah, and I think the important takeaway there, because I'll hear about these experiments that are in this condition or this condition, and they often end up with very specific examples of like splashed onto a rock and then washed back. But the point is that there are natural conditions where you can get these things to happen. So even if it doesn't happen the exact way that the experiment shows it happening, it is possible without a cell to get amino acids linking into proteins under certain conditions. And it's possible to get nucleotides linking into an RNA chain naturally.
Exactly. And that's the point. There was one...
well, I said naturally. Yeah. Outside of abiotically, I guess is the better way to say it.
Yeah, is it nature yet? Without any life in it?
What is nature?
And there was actually one experiment that made that point, because similar experiments have been done to the Urey Miller, where they were like, all right, let's put a bunch of stuff together and see if the more complex things can synthesize without the help of any organic, action. One in 2009 found that you could get what they called precursor compounds. They found that if you took what they called precursor compounds like acetylene and formaldehyde, that those could undergo reactions to produce at least two of RNA's nucleotides, so two of the building blocks, through these natural processes. And when that was criticized for those two compounds being a little too complex, of like, yeah, but those are still fancy, like simpler. One in 2015 was actually able to get the same reactions with even simpler building blocks. And once again showed that with natural energy sources, here it was UV light, you can get these structures being built. And they pointed out that on one hand, for like a criticism, most of them are different enough that they're not going to happen in the same place at the same time under the same conditions. So you won't get all the building blocks forming together at the same time during the same situation, but that they are forming in multiple situations. So like there's still that variety. And if it's happening across a globe, they said all you'd need is it to form in multiple places and then to have like a wave or water wash them into the same spot. Like they're still forming in water. So all you need is the water then to become mixed for some reason, and there's your primordial soup. But it would have been a fairly thin broth, as one thing put it. It's not as thick and goopy as we often picture the primordial soup being. So it's not like everything would have just been immediately globbing together. It's still, there's a lot of chance and luck with everything coming together the right way. But one of the biggest supporters of the RNA world hypothesis is something called ribozymes, which are RNA catalysts. So it is RNA that is sparking metabolic reactions, chemical reactions. The RNA doing it,
right? Which
which is typically the job of enzymes, which are proteins.
Right. This is an RNA-built equivalent to an enzyme.
Exactly. So ribozymes are really like one of the big supporters.
Right. RNA, the structure of RNA, can not only carry information, but also build, participate in the reactions that build proteins and whatnot, and also potentially kick off those reactions.
And one of the big smoking guns for that is that the ribosome inside our cells that builds proteins for our cells is a ribozyme.
Yeah.
So we have them in us doing that right now. So, like, proof is in the pudding sort of thing. Like, yes, RNA can do this stuff by itself as RNA, and that it could even potentially catalyze reactions to copy itself. Now, we've never naturally seen RNA do this, but researchers in labs have been able to synthetically get RNA to do this.
Okay, so it can do it.
RNA has the capability to copy itself by itself. With the right building blocks, of course. It needs enough to make another thing of RNA, but the RNA can do it. And so we are not settling on an answer here in this podcast because neither of us are experts.
And because there's not an answer. Well, there is an answer, but we don't have it.
But most of the RNA world hypothesis seems to be heavily supported by a lot of hands-on direct research and supported by researchers. Like, a lot of researchers seem to lean toward it as a very likely scenario. So it is once again, if you're gonna do a random Google, you'll probably see RNA world given a lot of attention, because a lot of the answers or questions that we need answered seem to be answered pretty well by this scenario.
Yeah. Well, and for me, the RNA first concept, I am nowhere near an expert in the chemistry of these questions.
No.
But it makes intuitive sense to me that once you have reproduction.
Yes.
Once you have, here's a bunch of molecules that do some chemical reactions and also reproduce themselves. Once you have reproduction, you can have a version of natural selection.
Exactly.
That here's a whole bunch, this particular environment that has given rise to the right kinds of amino acids, the right kinds of proteins, the right kind of RNA, basically, that have come together to create a very simple early version of a set of molecules that are in a little bubble. They're doing, some reactions, and then able to replicate, right? That molecule is able to then split off some more molecules that do a similar thing. Any reaction, any property, any trait that reaction set takes on that makes it more likely to reproduce again.
Exactly.
Is going to be inherited the next time it's so, like, one of them adds some molecules to the bubble and you have a primitive cell membrane. Mm-hmm. Well, now if it's more likely to reproduce, that's gonna get, like, the reproduction aspect adds a factor of selection that will help refine what that early proto-life is doing.
And that's really the nice thing about the RNA world point of view, is that while the metabolism first did have a way for it to pseudo-reproduce and pseudo-evolve, and had a way for it to chemically react, this potentially has legitimate, genetic Darwinian evolution almost from the get-go.
Right.
And because of ribozymes, can do some of that metabolic process, or at least build the things that could then start metabolizing.
Right. And then if that metabolism is contributing to the energy being brought in to help fuel these reactions, well, now you're getting some of that self-sustaining. Mm-hmm. And if you're powering yourself better and reproducing, that selection is going to then favor those metabolic processes. So it's one of those things where life to non-life seems like such a jump when you think of it in terms of rock to mushroom.
Exactly.
But when you think of it in terms of pile of chemical reactions, of molecules reacting to each other, which is happening everywhere all the time.
Yeah, it's a self-perpetuating chemical reaction.
Yeah. And then a bubble with self-perpetuating chemical reactions inside of it. Much less of a jump.
Yes. And as with most big questions like this, there are tons of people who have proposed and suggested a combination of the two.
Of course.
That maybe one part of the metabolism built independently somewhere and RNA was doing a thing somewhere, and then at some point those two were incorporated into one another. Like, there are combination hypotheses that use both, and for the, there's these two main camps, but in each there's also subset hypotheses.
Right.
There's this version of metabolism was what started first, or it started with this thing in this area, and same with the RNA. So like, there's multiple camps within those camps. So it gets very nitty gritty very quickly, because like you said, we're looking for that dividing line.
Right. And I think what I like about the evidence that has been built from these different experiments and that these different hypotheses are building off of is the fact that what they show is that the ingredients are here.
Yes.
Like, it's chemical reactions until you get the right combination of chemical reactions to produce something that is kind of like life.
Yep.
Which then can become more kind of like life, and so on. And it's that these aren't. This isn't a once in a bajillion chance to get. Mm-hmm. And that's so often the way it's framed is, oh well, the one in a bajillion chance to get these two molecules, and then the next one in a bajillion chance to get, and that no, actually these kinds of reactions are quite possible under a variety of conditions.
Yes, and it's a situation where the things that needed to have happened for life to have started evolving, because usually we say for it to have evolved, for it to have started making evolution a thing, because that's another thing that's very interesting with the origin of life, is it's also the origin of evolution.
Yes. Because biological evolution is evolution of life.
Yep. So
technically
that's why the definition of life, that is things that can undergo Darwinian evolution, also entails that the origin of life is the origin of Darwinian evolution.
Right.
So you have life when Darwinian evolution starts.
Right. It's a little.
Yeah.
You're circling around a little bit.
But it really seems, the more and more it's looked at, that the things that needed to happen for life to evolve are actually not that ridiculous. Now it's just discussing and arguing how it used those things to come to be.
Right, and which of those are more likely,
and which of those happen first.
Right, which of those fit better with what we see in our early Earth and in life today. It's something that I like to say, that so often in science, especially when you're looking at these questions from the outside, it can be easy to say, well, we don't have an answer, so we don't know.
Yes.
And I like to point out there is a difference between not knowing and having no idea.
Exactly.
We have tons of ideas and tons of evidence and tons of support. It's just that it's the hard part is knowing which parts of our hypotheses are true to what actually happens in the real world.
Well, I saw one quote in one of the articles that said, the fact that abiogenesis happened is not questioned.
Yeah, it has to have happened.
Yeah, it has to have happened.
There was once no life.
Yeah.
Now there is life.
And that it happened here on Earth is basically not argued. The mechanism by which it happened is what's debated. And so, yeah, it's not that we are just floundering without a direction or cause. It's just that we don't have the solid answer, but we have lots of evidence for the potential answers. And as we learn more, eventually we'll learn something that suddenly lines up with a number of those and negates a number of those, and now we can be a step closer.
Right.
But asking all these questions and doing these experiments is still important, because, saying like, hey, it could be RNA, but then if we don't test, well, yeah, but could RNA even do that?
Right.
Did it do that? We don't know. Can it do it? Yes, now we know. We know whether it can. And if it couldn't, then that negates that question altogether.
Yeah.
So we know what's potentially possible. Now it's just which one of those happened.
Yeah. There is, of course, the follow-up question, which is, why doesn't it happen anymore?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't happen nowadays.
Yep.
We have never seen this happen. And the argument that I often hear is that because the world is no longer conducive to that happening. Well, now it is a world governed by life that does not support the kind of conditions that you would need to get new life developing the way that it would have in the early Earth.
My first assumption, and I'm not an origin of life researcher, would just be that the things that were the building blocks of life and first synthesized life in primordial Earth's oceans are now being used by life.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, life is interrupting well, it's funnily, like, one way that is commonly pointed out is most life on Earth today uses and needs oxygen, and thus has produced a world full of oxygen.
Yeah.
But oxygen would probably have been poison to that early life. Another one that I always think about is stromatolites, which are the most ancient fossil evidence we have. These microbial mats are extremely rare today.
Yeah.
Very, very rare. And part of that is because there's a lot of things that eat microbial mats.
Exactly.
So they don't get the chance to form in most places.
Well, it's like, where are you going to get, the random amino acids and nucleic acids and lipids to start building a new form of life when those are all being used to build the current life?
Right, they keep getting vacuumed up.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when you have an established economy. Beforehand it was easy. Yeah, you could just go find food out in the forest, but now that's my forest.
Right.
I own that forest. Every boar in it. You dare to kill a king's deer. It's like now it's part of a set functioning ecosystem that doesn't allow a newcomer.
Which brings us back to the point that it's very difficult to answer these questions on a planet that is wholly different from the planet where it happened. There is another point that I always think about when we talk about this, and I like going over the chemical precursor ideas, because one of the sort of givens in a lot of these conversations, one of the sort of basic assumptions that people tend to latch onto is this idea that life originating is a rare one in a bajillion event.
That it's insane that it even happened.
Right. And part of that makes sense because as far as we know, it only happened once.
We only have proof that it's happened one time ever.
That being said, the fact that the chemical reactions necessary for this are, like, the biomolecules are not particularly uncommon.
Yep.
The fact that the evidence suggests that these kinds of chemical reactions can happen in a variety of conditions. And the point that I've seen others make, the earliest evidence of life on Earth, 3.5 billion years old or so, and it is generally agreed, is generally inferred that life probably originated around by the later part of the Hadean.
Yes.
Right? Around 4 billion years ago is probably where we would have seen.
Somewhere in that ballpark.
Somewhere in there is where we would see it. And I've seen some people point out that prior to that, for a while prior to that, the Earth was utterly tumultuous.
Yes.
Changing conditions, impacts.
A violent planet being birthed.
Right. In its formation. So it is quite possible that for at least some part of the earliest millions of years of the planet Earth, there wasn't a place for these things to even possibly happen. And when you think about it, life shows up on Earth pretty early on in in Earth history, and depending on how long that time period was that the Earth surface barely existed, and depending on how early that first life actually did make its appearance on the planet, life might have originated on the planet nearly as early as life could have originated on the planet.
Exactly.
And I always have this little thought rattling around in the back of my mind that there is reason to think, and again, I am not an expert, there are other more informed people asking these questions. I can't get over the thought that there is reason to think life originating might not actually be that ridiculous. And if I can bring this completely full circle, this won't make any sense to the people out there who skip the news section. We looked at chameleons.
Yes.
And we said, wow, how bizarre. What an unusual combination of traits. That how exciting it is to live at a time where we got to see this one-of-a-kind creature. And then we go to the fossil record, and the fossils record like, yeah, we did that at least twice.
Yeah, aren't they cool? Here's our version.
Yeah, we did that. It's easy to look at what we have and go, wow, one of a kind. What are the odds?
How could you even? We literally can't even conceive.
And the fact that then we look at, like, all right, Mars has similar conditions to early Earth.
Yep.
And Titan has similar conditions to early Earth.
And some of those places even have evidence of hydrothermal vents.
Yeah. And this takes us back to episode 26, astrobiology. Maybe it's not that ridiculous a thing for the right chemical compounds to create a bundle of self-sustaining, reproducing chemical reactions.
Yes. Well, there's a reason that if you go ask a biologist, do you think aliens exist? Vast majority of them, at least vast majority of the ones I've met, will say, yeah, for sure.
That's what I think.
If you ask, do you think we've ever been visited? That's where they go, well, no.
Right. What do you mean by aliens?
Exactly. But does alien life exist somewhere? Almost certainly.
I would be shocked.
Like, it is mathematically unlikely that it doesn't. Like, the maths doesn't support that we're the only form of life, just when you crunch the numbers, no matter what way you cut it. So, yeah, even if it's not super duper common, it's also not unlikely.
Yeah, it might be, again, it is the blinders of living at the time and place we do. It might be unlikely here.
Yes.
Where we are.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it's not that, maybe it's not as big a deal as we like to think it is. And how incredible would it be to have that, add that to the list of all the things we're like, well, we humans produce music, and we are unique. Well, okay, there's whales and birds over there. Well, we humans have societies. Okay, well, here are ants.
Yep.
And here are we farm. Okay, well, here's this other thing.
Yeah.
We are alive.
Yeah, we're just part of it.
How cool would it be to have that also ticked off the list of things we think are unique and special about us?
Yes.
So as you said at the beginning of the episode, this gets philosophical.
It gets very philosophical very quickly.
And I'm glad that we got to do this topic. Yes. I think this is a worthy entry for our new journey into triple-digit episode numbers.
I think this is a good way to kick it off. This was an awesome episode with an awesome topic suggested by awesome people.
Sure was.
But before we wrap up, we have some patron questions.
Yeah, you know what? We have this long building list of patron questions. So as longtime listeners will know, we answer questions from patrons at a certain level. Yeah. It's one of the goodies you get on Patreon.
You submit it, we answer it on the podcast.
And we have this list building up, and we thought, hey, we're celebrating for episode 100. Why not throw a few of them out there?
Yeah, answer a question per digit.
So we've picked a few patron questions. They'll be pretty short. We picked a couple of quick ones to knock out here on episode 100. The first one is from Sam, who says, I like to listen to episodes multiple times because I've forgotten most of it after a few months. How much do you, the hosts, retain from each episode? Especially when one of you leads the discussion and the other one is following.
Mm-hmm. I find it varies a lot. Like, there are some episodes I seem to remember really clearly, and then others that, like, if you ask me what we said, I wouldn't even be able to quite quote the outline we used.
Oh yeah,
like
I retain bits, and definitely I remember my episodes more clearly than I remember yours.
Absolutely, no.
Because I'm doing the research and I'm learning a bunch of stuff, and then I'm leading it and I'm doing the whole thing. But no, I also forget a lot of what we've gone over in the past.
I'm pretty sure, for me, the trend is, and this is, not a huge revelation, I'm sure, for anybody, the topics that I enjoyed more, and I enjoy all the episodes we do. It's not like we've ever done one it's like, okay, and now we're going to talk about natural, right. I'm never hating it, but there are definitely some topics where it's like, I personally will, enjoyed the episode on horses, because I liked that topic. I liked it before it was requested. And those typically stick with me a little bit more. I think typically if the notes were easier for me to take, which factors into that, I remember it more. If I was having to really trudge through because I was having a difficult time with the notes, those don't seem to stick as well. I
remind myself that repetition is a good educational tool.
Oh, yeah.
So if we're saying the same things on multiple episodes of the podcast, that's just for the benefit of the listeners.
Yeah.
And not at all because we forgot
Yep.
that we already said a thing. Really what it means is we have to go back and listen to our own episodes in order. I've done that.
Yep.
I've definitely, like, I'll get a script to write for one of my freelance positions, and it'll be like, write about this, and I'm like, well, as it turns out, I know a guy who did an episode about this topic. Although I very rarely listen to our podcast.
Nope.
I don't want to listen to that.
I was gonna say, like, within the last year, I'd be willing to re-listen to, episodes more readily. But as soon as you're like, hey, re-listen to the first 10 or 20, it's like, oh, do I have to?
See, some people will reach out and be like, I listened to episode 5 and it was great, and I'm like, was it really?
Are you sure?
I'll take your word for it.
We were so new. Our next patron question is from Cheryl, who asks very straightforward and simply, does David have the entire episode list memorized?
Yep.
Yeah, he does.
Not the details.
No.
But no, the numbers?
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, give me a number between 1 and 100.
1 and 100, let's go with 43.
The Great American Biotic Interchange.
It's the Gabby.
Yeah, that's the Gabby. It's good stuff. That doesn't... Listen, so a little bit... we've talked about this before, and I think we actually did have a question at one point that was about this. That's not like... I don't have a photographic memory, which is a thing that I'm not convinced it exists.
Everything I've heard and read about it is that's not actually... It's not something you're born with.
It's not that I, like, have a perfect memory for these things. It's, one, I'm good at memorizing lists, but also I go through this list over and over and over, because I go through our stats, and I go through our downloads, and I go through, like, all that stuff. And also, if I'm being honest, it's become a bit of a shtick.
Yep.
So I do test myself on the list on a fairly regular basis to make sure I don't forget them, because now I'm proud of it.
Yep.
And I want to be able to keep doing it.
Well, you also had previous practice, because this is not the first lengthy list of numbers and names you've memorized.
That is true. It is absolutely not. Some people will ask, how long do you think you'll be able to keep that up? And I will say, as of the end of 2020, I think that I will be able to do it for a good 898 episodes.
Yes.
We have another question, one more question, before we wrap it up. This is another question from Sam for Will specifically. Do you have any great stories or advice related to aquarium SciComm that you'd like to share?
Ooh, absolutely. So yeah, working at the aquarium, the biggest difference I noticed doing SciComm there is, like, at the museum, you have lots of people who are interested in the topics, but with animals, people have a much more visceral reaction. Sometimes good, but also dealing with people who are scared of the animals or only know stereotypes about the animals, the things that show in movies. And so the biggest thing I always tried to keep in mind is that every animal was just an animal, and to present it to them that way, and to keep my temperament sending that message, because I understand the temptation to want to upsell the fact that it's like, ooh, I'm carrying a snake. Like, that's fun, and with the right groups, you can get a laugh. But I always leaned toward, I treated every animal with kind of a more midline, where I was still excited about them, but I didn't treat that the shark was more exciting than the pufferfish,
right? Or
that it was, a better topic. Yes, we talked about it more because that's what people ask questions about. But the shark is just another animal. It's not a movie star.
Right. This was something that would come up at the nature center that I worked at, is especially when you're handling animals, what you're doing with them, irrespective of the things you're saying.
Yes.
How you are interacting with that animal is a model for other people.
It sends huge amounts of messages.
And that the way you're holding them, your attitude towards them, your tone of voice is modeling for other people how they should react to that. Even if you're saying the right things, which is why I always am aware of and annoyed by documentaries.
Yeah.
When, like, the shark will come on, and maybe you're saying all the right things about sharks.
Actually correct and interesting.
But if the music is horror movie music, you're sending the wrong message.
We actually had to petition my aquarium to change the shark tunnel music because of that.
Cool.
And it was the same issue. And so for me, it goes the two directions on, I don't treat scary animals like they're scary. I acknowledge that people are afraid of them, and there were times where I had to acknowledge it's like, yeah, we're talking about an alligator. We're in Florida. These live literally in your backyard. They are potentially dangerous. Like, you had to acknowledge that, but I didn't treat them like they were a scary animal. I didn't use that as part of my teaching tool. And on the flip side, I also never treated an animal like they were boring. I never was like, oh, that's just a box turtle. Mm-hmm. No, that's a box turtle. It's a box turtle. You want to talk about box? Like, I keeping a level treatment.
The first time I ever wrote for SciShow, my first script that I ever wrote for SciShow was about poisonous snakes. Rhabdophis, keelback snakes. And that was the idea, that was the shtick. It's like, hey, there is a group of snakes that are poisonous in addition to being venomous. Cool, cool, cool. It was my first ever script. And I wrote the whole thing, and I had put a title, like a placeholder title. Oftentimes I will let editors decide on the title, because that's a whole different game.
There's a whole different list of considerations.
Making headlines and titles. And what the editor... And this person was a great editor. Like, this is not at all a knock on any other person's participation. But the title that either the editor or someone along the way had ended up putting together, the title was, Beware Poisonous Snakes.
Yep.
And the idea was, okay, exciting language, exclamation mark, that's going to be the title. And I remember seeing it and going, this is my first writing job. Do I be the guy? Yeah. Am I going to be the nitpicky one? And I did. I made a note where I said, can we say behold?
Yeah.
Behold poisonous snakes, because I try as best I can not to use language of fear.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to, and I whenever I say that, I think we do that a lot. You know, we'll talk about things on the podcast as terrifying.
Oh yeah.
But I try not to make it about the animal. I try not to use it in a context where somebody might come away from it thinking that they should actually be afraid or wary or uncomfortable around a certain group of animals.
Well, there's definitely a difference between comedic, when we're trying to say something for the sake of a joke we think's funny,
which is the important part.
Yep. Versus when you're, answering questions about the animal or talking about the animal in front of the animal. Like, so there's definitely times and places for things. It's not that we can't make jokes or, that I don't enjoy the movie Jaws sort of thing. But yeah, that was my biggest experience, is especially because I feel like many people might be surprised how common it is for people to be actually utterly terrified of name an animal. Like, I've met people who are afraid of lizards and hermit crabs. And as ridiculous as that might seem to someone who is more comfortable with them, for them it's very real. And treating that animal with the same energy and mentality as any other animal helps level the playing field.
Which is why it's always fun when it's why being on the podcast and taking requests from listeners has been so much fun, because a listener will suggest a topic and they'll say, I want an episode about about reefs or about grass or about this topic. That what that then means to me when I look at the topic is, all right, it is my responsibility to get excited about this thing. And it's so much fun to then find what's exciting about, or to research into what I think is exciting about something, because it's not only part of good science communication to be excited and engaging, but it's fun to then. So we could talk about these things all the time. And again, hey, we're doing our end of the year Q&A, so if you have more questions along these lines,
absolutely
look at that form. Hey, thanks to those people for asking their patron questions. Thanks to our requesters. Keep your eyes out for our bonus 100 episode retrospective episode. Keep your eyes out for the form for our end of the year Q&A. Link in the description, link on our social media. Ask us whatever questions you want. We will answer them however long it takes. Hashtag whatever it takes.
Patrons, keep an eye out for our chat that we'll be setting up. And if you're interested in being part of that, check out our Patreon.
Thanks for sticking with us through this supersized special episode 100 of the Common Descent podcast.
It was a lot of fun.
Here's looking to 100 more. Our next milestone, which, listen, I'm triple digits is old hat.
Right. Yeah.
I'll see you at 1,000.
Yep. We got to get to that next digit. That's the only reason we're doing this now.
That's it. That's it. It's all a drag from here. It's a crawl.
Goodbye for now, everyone.
Bye. Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.